This boy had been sleeping at the back of the classroom for 16 years. He was jolted awake by a blow to the back of the head from a scroll, and the first thing he realized in this unfamiliar body was that the treatise held by the shouting teacher was the very one on which he had defended his dissertation in his past life, and that in the 7th line there was an error that had caused the clan students to their bodies from the inside. The blow is sharp and ringing. The scroll smacks the back of his head, and the boy opens his eyes for real for the first time. Above him is a wooden ceiling painted with clouds. It smells of dry straw and old paper. A bell rings in the courtyard, and Teacher Pak is yelling in his ear. He's screaming that Seo Jihwan has fallen asleep in class again. He's yelling that if he likes sleeping so much, he should go to the pigsty. The teacher is holding a scroll in his hand, that very one, the treatise on the 7 breaths.
The White Heron Clan's basic technique. And in that very moment, something clicks in the boy's head. Memories flood back in 2 streams at once. One is someone else's. 16 years of quiet life in the back row. A cold room in the courtyard, the faces of classmates who laughed, the warm hands of his mother, who died when he was 8. The other stream was his own. Graduate school, Seoul National University, 3 sleepless nights before his thesis defense, a car plunging into the river, a final thought that he should have gotten some sleep, then darkness. Then that blow with the scroll. Daniel Seo opens his eyes in a stranger's body, and the first thing he realizes is that he has finally slept. For real. His head is as clear as a winter morning after a snowfall. The second thing he realizes is that he knows the scroll in the teacher's hand by heart. He defended his dissertation based on it. He had read the 1640 copy. He knows that in the 7th line of the 2nd section, there is a scribal error. It should say, breathe out, instead of breathe in. And because of this one mistake, half the clan students have been damaging their meridians for 300 years, including the boy whose body he now occupies, who is also heading straight for that breakdown. Daniel slowly sits down. He rubs his cheek, which bears the imprint of the mat. Teacher Pak is still yelling, but the sound is fading. 30 pairs of eyes watch the sleepy boy from the back row and wait for the usual. That he'll hang his head. That he'll mumble an apology. That he'll bury his face in the desk again. Daniel looks at the teacher calmly and steadily. He says he's asking for forgiveness. He says he was thinking about the 7th line. A silence hangs in the classroom. Teacher Park asks him to repeat that. Daniel repeats it. The 7th line of the 2nd section. There's a mistake there. Breathe in is a calque from oral tradition. In the original, it was breathe out. That's why 1/3 of the students burn out in their 3rd year. The silence grows thick. Someone in the middle row stops breathing. Teacher Park slowly lowers the scroll. His face goes through 3 expressions in a row. Rage, bewilderment, and a 3rd one he doesn't even know the name of. He asks where the boy got that from. And right then, Daniel freezes. He can't tell the truth. He can't say he read it in the library either, because anyone could check and find the standard edition with the same mistake. Daniel says he saw an old man in a blue hanbok in a dream who explained it to him. And that's not a lie. Somewhere in the very depths of his memory, which is now his own, that old man really does exist. Teacher Park stares at the boy for a long time. Then he does something no one expects. He places the scroll on the table. He orders the class to read the next 10 pages, and he calls Seo Jihwan to follow him. Daniel stands up. His legs feel foreign
the thin 16-year-old legs of a boy who is never really trained. He walks and nearly trips over a student's crookedly tied sash. Someone snorts to his right. Daniel recognizes the face instantly. Jihwan's memory prompts the name. Kim Tae-hyun, the golden student, the heir to the main branch, the one who first tripped Jihwan up in the training yard 3 years ago, the one who came up with the nickname Sonia. Right now, Tae-hyun is looking at Daniel with the cold smile of a man who expects the punishment to be particularly humiliating. Daniel meets his gaze and doesn't look away. Jihwan's body instinctively wants to lower his head. Daniel won't let him. Tae-hyun blinks first, not out of fear, out of surprise. Daniel follows his teacher out. The academy corridor is long and cool. The floorboards creak underfoot. Scrolls hang on the walls bearing the names of students who once became masters.
Master Park walks ahead in silence, and Daniel goes over in his head everything he knows about the White Heron clan. 700 years of history, the 12 great gates, the time of thin ice, which he had read about in a little-known article in his past life, but had dismissed as the author's fantasy. But it turned out not to be a fantasy. It turns out he himself is walking down the corridor of this very academy. Teacher Park stops at the door. The scent of herbs wafts from behind it. Dry wormwood, juniper, something else, bitter and warm. The teacher says Elder Yoon is inside. If the boy lied about the dream, the elder would find out within 10 breaths, and then it would have been better for the boy never to have been born. But if he hadn't lied, his life would change today. Master Park pushed the door open. Daniel stepped inside. Elder Yoon's room was small and dark. Paper windows let in a soft yellow light. A thin reed mat lay on the floor. Against the far wall stood a low bench, and on it lay a boy of about 12. The boy was crying, quietly, through clenched teeth. That's how people cry when they already know that screaming won't help. The left half of his body was red from internal heat. The right half was pale, almost blue. Daniel recognized the condition instantly. Meridian collapse, 3rd year of training, the 7th line. That very one. An old man in a simple gray hanbok sat above the boy. His face was weathered and expressionless. His eyes were white, completely white, without pupils. A leather case containing needles lay on Elder Yoon's lap. Yoon ran his fingers over them slowly, by touch. Teacher Park bowed at the door. He said he had brought a student about whom he had just heard strange things. Elder Yoon did not move. He said he had heard a scream from the hallway and therefore already knew half of it. He ordered Teacher Park to leave the boy and close the door from the outside. Master Park obeyed. The door closed behind him with a soft rustle. Daniel remained standing. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He didn't know why. Perhaps because Jihwan's body had long since grown accustomed to not showing fear. Perhaps because, for the first time in his life, Daniel was standing before a man he had read about in historical records. Elder Yoon Chong-gu, healer of the White Heron clan, blind for 46 years. For 46 years, he has been healing his students' broken meridians. The best healer on the continent, according to unofficial rankings. Yoon spoke first.
He said the boy on the couch was dying. Not immediately, in 3 or 4 days. He said the usual acupuncture pattern wouldn't help because the stagnant heat was dissipating too slowly and the right side of the body had already lost sensation. He said he'd heard Teacher Park muttering in the hallway about the 7th line. He asked if the boy knew what the 7th line was. Daniel took a step forward.
He said he knew. He said that in the 1270 edition of Jihwan's treatise, there is a third point between the swan's knee point and the crane's joint point, 1 kun above the swan's knee, unnamed in modern diagrams. In the old edition, it was called the silent door. Through it, stagnant heat does not rise up the meridian, but flows sideways into the small circulation. This explains why 1/3 of the students burn out and 2/3 do not. For those born with the silent door slightly offset, the heat dissipates on its own. For the rest, it accumulates. Yoon was silent for a long time. Then he asked how the boy knew this. Daniel mentioned the dream again, about the old man in the blue hanbok. Yoon turned his blind face toward him for a long time. A very long time. He said that only Jihwan himself had ever worn a blue hanbok, and only 3 of his direct disciples in the entire history of the clan. That none of them had lived for 300 years. That if the boy was lying now, Yoon would know it by the tremor in his voice, and then the boy would regret ever being born. He asked if the boy was lying. Daniel said he wasn't lying. His voice didn't waver. Yoon was silent again. Then he did something Daniel didn't expect. He handed him the needle. He said that if the boy was right, let the boy insert it himself. Daniel froze. Jihwan's body had never held an acupuncture needle. A 16-year-old's hands would tremble. But deep down, Daniel knew exactly where to insert it. He had seen that point on dozens of diagrams. He had described it in one of his articles. He just had never held the needle himself. He took the needle from Yoon's fingers. He walked over to the cot. The boy on the cot looked at him with wet eyes. There was an animalistic hope in that gaze. Daniel placed his left hand on the boy's shoulder. He felt for the point very carefully. 1 kun above the swan's knee, slightly to the side of the spine. Jihwan's fingers found it on their own. The body knew. Not Daniel, the body. And Daniel realized in that moment that Jihwan, the boy, had seen these diagrams in his dreams so many times in his life that his hands remembered them without thinking. The needle went in easily, without resistance. Daniel turned it a quarter turn counterclockwise. The boy on the couch sighed once, deeply, then again. After 7 breaths, the heat began to recede from his face. After 10, the boy closed his eyes. His breathing became even. Yoon sat motionless. He heard every breath. A minute later, he reached out his hand. He touched the spot where the needle had entered. He ran his fingers around it. He said quietly that this spot really existed, that he felt a current beneath the skin that shouldn't be there according to the diagram he'd been taught, that the current was right, that the boy was alive and would live. Yoon lowered his hand. He was silent for a very long time. Then he turned his blind face toward the door. He spoke loudly so they could hear him in the hallway. "Teacher Park, this boy no longer sits in the back row. This boy sits next to me." A rustling sound came from the hallway. Teacher Park had been eavesdropping.
Now Teacher Park was running down the hallway at a brisk pace. Yoon turned back to Daniel. He said he wanted to ask one question in private. He asked if the boy saw anyone else in his dream besides the old man in the blue hanbok. Daniel thought for a second, and for the first time, he honestly said yes. He said he saw a woman with a sword. He saw a monk with a brush. He saw an old woman with herbs. He saw many others. Yoon closed his white eyes. He said quietly that he had suspected as much, that he had heard a legend as a child from his teacher, that he didn't believe it, that he wouldn't talk about it now, that the boy should go back to the dormitory and sleep.
And that tomorrow morning the boy would come here, and they would start over.
Daniel bowed, not very gracefully. Jihwan's body had long since lost the ability to bow with dignity. Yoon sensed it. He smiled with one corner of his mouth. He said they would fix the bows, too. Daniel left the room. Master Park was no longer in the hallway. Outside in the courtyard, a soft spring rain was falling on the flagstones. It had rained all night. Daniel returned to Jihwan's in the outer courtyard. The room was small. A mat on the floor, a low table, a trunk with 2 changes of clothes, a clay cup. Nothing else. A single scroll hung on the wall. The calligraphy was uneven, childish. Jihwan's memory immediately told him. He had written this himself at the age of 10. 2 years after his mother's death. A single character. Patience. Daniel stared at this character for a long time. Then he sat down on the mat. He removed his belt. He untied his hanbok. The 16-year-old's body was thin.
His ribs stuck out. On his left shoulder was an old scar from falling out of a tree. His memory told him it had happened when he was 8, a week after his mother's funeral.
Jihwan had climbed the tree to retrieve a silk ribbon that the wind had blown from her altar. Daniel ran his fingers over the scar. Something tightened inside him. It wasn't his pain, but now it was his pain too. He lay down on the mat. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in the 28 years of his past life, he wasn't afraid to fall asleep. He knew where he was going. The hall of the sleeping master opened up around him like an old fan unfolding. The space was vast and yet cozy. A wooden floor, tall columns, paper windows along the entire far wall through which white light streamed from who knows where, meditation cushions on the floor, scrolls on the walls, not textbooks, personal ones, handwritten notes, letters, diaries,
monuments to thought that, in the real world, had long since burned or decayed. In the center of the hall sat an old man in a blue hanbok. He was drinking tea. He looked up when Daniel entered. He said he had been waiting. He said the boy had taken a long time to get there, that in a past life the boy had already been here 5 times, but each time he'd woken to an alarm clock before the message was finished. Daniel sank onto the cushion opposite him. The old man poured him some tea. The cup was real, warm to the touch. The tea smelled of jasmine and something else, bitter. The old man introduced himself. Hwan Jae-ho, founder of the White Heron clan. 700 years since his birth, if you count by the standard calendar. 200 years since his death, if you're being honest. Daniel bowed, as best he could from this life and the last. Hwan smiled. He said the boy was writing an article about him.
in a past life. He called him a stubborn donkey. Daniel remembered. Indeed.
The third page of the dissertation. There was a sentence about how Juan was a stubborn donkey when it came to passing down techniques orally. Daniel felt his face flush. The old man laughed. He said he wasn't offended. He said he had been a stubborn donkey, and that was exactly why the boy was here now, because the boy was the only one who had noticed that Juan's stubbornness had ruined an entire generation of students 300 years after his death, because Juan had insisted that the treatise be passed down only orally, and then the very first scribe had made a mistake. Juan lowered his eyes to his cup. He said he wanted to talk business. He said the boy didn't have much time, not just tonight, but in general, that something was approaching in Chungyang that no one at the academy spoke of aloud, that Juan didn't have not many candles left. Daniel didn't understand the part about the candles. Juan didn't explain. He said he would explain later. He said that for now, they would start small, with Elder Yoon. That after 46 years of blindness, Yoon saw the light for the first time today. That the boy must make it permanent. That Yoon has an illness he doesn't tell anyone about, his lungs. 10 years ago, during a training session, Yoon inhaled cold air at the wrong moment, and part of the lower lobe of his left lung stopped working. Yoon learned to live with it, keeps it hidden. No one knows except him. Juan said there is a way, a simple one, a breathing exercise from a treatise that burned 400 years ago. Juan wrote it himself. Juan dictated it. Daniel memorized it, not as words, as a sensation. 8 movements of the ribs, 3 points of focus, a sound on the exhale that the ear won't hear, but the lung itself will. Daniel repeated it in his mind. Juan nodded. He said that would be enough, that tomorrow the boy should show it to Yoon, that Yoon would understand. Daniel asked if he could ask a question. Juan said he could. Daniel asked how much time he had. Juan was silent for a long time. Then he said that tonight was one night. By the hall's standards, that was a week. That the boy should get used to it. That the next night he would meet another teacher. That there were 6 of them in total. That there had been 7, but 1 had gone out. Daniel didn't understand about the candles again, and again he didn't ask. The hall began to brighten. Juan said the boy was waking up, that the boy shouldn't be afraid of one thing, that when the boy opened his eyes, he would remember not only what he had learned here, he would also remember what Jihwan had forgotten, because they were now one person, and that some of those memories would hurt. Daniel nodded. Juan finished his tea. He said one last thing before the boy woke up, that the boy was a good historian, but a bad student. That a historian describes while a student does. That it was time to learn to do. Daniel opened his eyes. It was a gray morning in the room. The rain had stopped. Sitting on the bench next to him was a boy he hadn't seen yesterday. A small boy, about 12 years old. The very same one who had been in Yoon's room. The boy looked at him with delight. He said his name was Do-hyun, that Elder Yoon had sent him, that Yoon was waiting for Jihwan Sonbe in the healer's room, that Yoon had asked him to pass on a single word: lungs. Daniel slowly sat up. He realized that Juan had already beaten him to it. Daniel followed Do-hyun across the courtyard. The rain had left dark spots on the flagstones.
The air was cold and clear. Do-hyun walked ahead with small, quick steps and kept turning around as if to check that his sonbae hadn't disappeared. Daniel noticed that the boy was limping on his right leg. Not badly. Jihwan's memory suggested the family name, Cho. The younger branch, lame from birth. Jihwan knew this child only by sight. He had never spoken to him. Now Daniel spoke.
He asked quietly if his leg hurt after yesterday. Do-hyun was surprised that his sonbae had noticed. He said his leg didn't hurt, that his chest hurt but less than yesterday, that for the first time in a month he had slept without dreams. Daniel took note. They reached Yoon's room. The door was open. Yoon was sitting on the same cushion. 2 cups of tea stood before him. Yoon turned his blind face. He said that Do-hyun could leave, that the sonbae and the elder were having a conversation. Do-hyun bowed and ran off. Daniel sat down across from Yoon. Yoon was silent for a minute. Then he said he hadn't slept all night, that he had been thinking, that at 3 a.m. he remembered a legend he had heard from his first teacher as a child, a legend about the hall where forgotten masters gather, that he had considered it a fairy tale for younger students, that yesterday, for the first time in 50 years, he thought the fairy tale might be true. He said he wouldn't ask any questions right now, that the boy didn't have the words to answer anyway, that he simply accepted it.
Yoon paused. Then he said one more thing. He said that Do-hyun had whispered something strange to him yesterday, that when the sonbae was inserting the needle, Do-hyun felt someone's hand rest on his shoulder. Warm. Big. Not Jihwan's hand. That Do-hyun turned around, but didn't see anyone. Yoon asked if the boy knew whose hand it was. Daniel thought for a moment. He said quietly that he had a hunch, that yesterday in a dream, the man who teaches him said he wanted to help. Yoon nodded once. He said that was fine. That today they would tackle the second matter, that Yoon himself had a problem, that Yoon hadn't spoken to anyone about it in 50 years. Daniel interrupted, very carefully. He said he knew. Lungs. Lower left lobe. 10 years ago. Cold air at the wrong time. Yoon froze. His face turned white.
He asked in a voice that Daniel would remember for a long time who had said it. Daniel replied that it was the same man. Yoon closed his white eyes. He sat very upright. Then he opened them. He said he believed it, that he no longer had any doubts, that the boy should tell him what to do. Daniel described the exercise that Hwan had dictated in the hall. 8 movements of the ribs, 3 points of focus, a sound on the exhale. Yoon listened without interrupting. Then he sat down in the breathing posture. He did the first cycle. Daniel watched and corrected him, not like a student to an elder, like someone who remembers for both of them. Yoon did the second cycle, the third. On the 7th cycle, for the first time in 10 years, he took a deep breath. The lower left lobe stirred. Yoon opened his eyes. There were no tears, but his mouth tightened into a firm line. He said quietly what he was feeling, that he hadn't believed it was possible. Daniel said nothing. Yoon stood up. He paced the room. He took a few more breaths as he walked. He said that now they had a problem. He said that when Teacher Park ran into the elders' hall yesterday, he told everyone. That the entire council already knew about the boy. That half the elders were thrilled, that half were furious. That Elder Moon Hosok
head of the Hosok, had sent a letter that morning. The letter demanded that the boy be brought in for a meeting this afternoon. Yoon said he wouldn't hand the boy over to Moon alone, that he would go with him, but that the boy needed to understand who he was dealing with. Yoon explained. Elder Moon, 62 years old. 20 years ago, he convinced the Council of 12 that there is only one correct edition of the great treatises, his. Since then, all other editions have been considered heresy. Half of the old families make their living selling copies of Moon's version.
If the boy proves publicly that Moon's version contains errors, the system that has held the clan together for 20 years will collapse. Moon understands this. Moon is no fool. Moon will act subtly. First, he'll try to persuade, then he'll threaten, then he'll bribe. If nothing works, then something else. Yoon looked at Daniel with blind eyes. He said the boy shouldn't reveal everything today, that the boy should reveal just enough to pique Moon's interest, but not scare him, that if Moon gets scared right away, the boy won't live to see tomorrow. Daniel nodded. He said he understood. He said that in his past life, he'd also known people who clung to the wrong versions of texts, and he knew how to talk to them. Yoon smirked. He said that was good. He said they had 3 hours until the meeting, and in those 3 hours, the boy would learn to bow properly. Because if Moon saw that the boy didn't know how to bow, Moon would decide the boy was uneducated and lose interest. And they needed Moon to keep his interest. And he was afraid. Yoon stood behind Daniel. He placed his hands on his shoulders. He said they were starting. For 3 hours, Yoon positioned Jihwan's body into the correct postures. The elder's blind hands knew exactly where everything should be. Daniel watched and memorized, and he was angry at the body that wouldn't obey. And he was angry at Jihwan, who had walked with a broken posture for 3 years. And he was angry at himself, who had taught Taekwondo in a past life and thought he knew about posture. After 3 hours, Daniel was bowing correctly. Jihwan's body stood straight for the first time in 12 years. Yoon stepped back. He said it was time to go. The council hall was large and cold. The wooden floor was polished to a mirror-like shine. Around the perimeter were 12 low tables for the 12 elders. At each table sat a man dressed in the attire of his rank. White for the inner circle teachers, gray for the healers, dark blue for the archivists, and one seat in the center. A black hanbok with silver embroidery of cranes. Elder Moon Hosok, 62 years old, evenly graying hair, a smooth face, narrow, attentive eyes. His hands were folded on his knees, a jade ring on his right pinky. Daniel entered behind Yoon. He bowed as he had been taught, deeply, steadily, without haste, not too long, not too fast. Yoon stood to the left, slightly behind. This was important. The elder who brought the student stands behind and to the left. Daniel knew this from his own historical studies. Jihwan's body didn't flinch. Moon spoke first. His voice was soft. He said he had heard something unusual. He said that over the past 2 days, the young Seo Jihwan had demonstrated knowledge that a student of the outer court should not possess. He said that the council welcomed every talent, that the White Heron had always nurtured geniuses, that Moon personally wanted to understand where the boy had acquired this knowledge. Not for an interrogation, for a conversation. Daniel looked up. He met Moon's gaze and felt what Hwan had warned him about in the hall. Moon wasn't looking at him like a teacher looks at a student.
Moon was looking at him like a hunter looks at a trail. Calmly, for a long time, memorizing every detail. Daniel lowered his eyes again, not out of fear, calculatingly. He said he thanked the elder for his attention. He said he didn't consider himself a genius. He said he simply had dreams. Dreams in which old men show him pages. That the boy doesn't choose what to see. That he wakes up and remembers. Moon smiled with one corner of his mouth. He said that dreams come in many forms. He said that in the clan's history there had already been students who dreamed of treatises, that 3 of them became masters, that 7 became madmen, that the council must determine which type the young Seo Jihwan belongs to. He said he proposed a simple test. He brought a scroll.
He placed it in front of Daniel. The scroll was old, very old. Daniel recognized the binding, the 8th edition of the Crane Step treatise. Moon said that there was one difficult part in this scroll, the 3rd chapter, 6 stanzas, that these 6 stanzas had been the subject of debate for 300 years, that the 3 schools interpreted them differently, that the boy should read it and say which interpretation was correct. Daniel opened the scroll, and he sensed the trap instantly. This was not a test of knowledge, it was a test of loyalty. If the boy said that Moon's school's interpretation was correct, Moon would receive public confirmation from the prodigy and settle the matter for years to come. If the boy said that one of the other 2 interpretations was correct, Moon would gain an enemy. If the boy said that the 4th interpretation, which none of the 3 schools had seen, Moon would gain an enemy squared, and the council would face a scandal. Daniel slowly read the 3rd chapter. He knew the 6 stanzas by heart from his past life, and he knew the 4th interpretation, and he knew it was correct. But he knew something else as well, that there was a 5th interpretation that no one had guessed. Juan had mentioned it briefly in his personal notes, which had been burned in the 16th century. The 5th interpretation did not contradict any of the 4. It united them. It showed that the 3 schools had argued for a reason and that each saw part of the truth. Daniel looked up. He spoke calmly. He said that the 3 interpretations did not contradict one another, that they described a single movement from 3 different points of view, that the Green Wind School looks at the foot, that the School of Silent Snow looks at the hip, that the School of True Transmission looks at the breath, that the movement is one, that different vantage points yield different words, but the meaning is the same. That if all 3 instructions are followed simultaneously, the complete technique is achieved. The silence in the hall grew thick. One of the elders on the right slowly lowered the cup he was holding. He looked at Daniel without blinking, for a very long time. Then he smiled again, this time more broadly. He said the boy was smart. He said the boy had given an answer that didn't offend anyone. He said that was a rare quality. He said he would like to have the boy as his personal student, that he was offering a place in the inner courtyard, his own room, his own library, to personally impart knowledge. It was an offer he couldn't refuse, and one that Daniel had to refuse. Yoon behind him didn't move. Daniel sensed that the elder was waiting. Daniel bowed, correctly once again. He said he thanked Elder Moon for the honor. He said he could not accept it. He said that yesterday Elder Yoon had announced him as his successor in the presence of Master Park, and the council already knew of this. That changing teachers a day after the announcement would be an insult to Elder Yoon.
that the boy could not begin his journey with an insult. Moon froze, just for a moment. Then the smile returned, wider than before. He said that the boy was not only intelligent, but also devoted. He said he respected the decision. He said the offer still stood, if circumstances ever changed. Daniel bowed once more. Yoon tilted his head slightly. They left the council chamber. In the hallway, Yoon stopped, his blind face turned toward Daniel. He said quietly that the boy now had an enemy for life. He said that Moon does not forgive such refusals, that the war began today, that the boy should prepare himself. He said one more thing. He said that the boy's answer about the 3 schools was brilliant.
That Yoon himself hadn't seen in 40 years 3 interpretations of a single concept. That the boy might indeed be the one spoken of in the legend. Yoon was silent. Then he said they had one more matter to attend to before evening, that a girl was lying in the infirmary. 13 years old, the daughter of a herbalist from a village at the foot of the mountain. Her mother had brought her along because the mother was coughing up blood. The mother wasn't a member of the clan, so the infirmary had turned them away. The girl had been sitting by the door since morning. No one was coming out. Yoon said he'd heard crying, that he wanted to take a look, that the boy should come with him. Daniel nodded. They went to the infirmary. A girl was indeed sitting at the door, skinny, freckled, with a basket of herbs on her lap. She looked up when they approached, and Daniel recognized her. Not by her face, by Jihwan's memory. It was Han Yuna, the herbalist's daughter, who brought fresh herbs to the academy once a week, and whom Jihwan had once helped lift her basket 2 years ago when she had tripped. Yuna had smiled at him then. Jihwan had remembered that smile for 2 years. Now Yuna wasn't smiling. She was crying quietly so no one behind the door would hear. Yoon stopped. He told Daniel that there was one more thing, that Yuna's mother was slowly dying, that the academy wouldn't treat her because she was a peasant, that the boy might have something in his dreams for this illness. Daniel crouched down next to the girl. He asked very carefully if he could look at the herbs in her basket. Yuna lifted her tear-stained face. She recognized him. She was surprised. She silently held out the basket. Daniel sorted through the herbs, one by one. He recognized each one. He memorized which ones were there and which were missing, and he recalled a 16th century recipe he had noted in a footnote of his dissertation. A simple recipe, a rustic one that the Academy's masters had deemed too simple to take seriously, and one that was missing a single herb, the one Yuna considered a weed and didn't gather. Daniel looked up at the girl. He said quietly that he knew what was needed. Yuna held her breath. Daniel sat down next to Yuna right on the stone slabs. Yoon remained standing slightly to the side. The blind man's face was turned toward the door of the infirmary, from which no one had emerged. Daniel spoke softly. He said he wanted to help her mother. He said he knew the recipe. He said the recipe called for 7 herbs, and Yuna had 6 of them in her basket. That the 7th grew by the stream behind the eastern wall. That Yuna knew it. That she thought it was a weed. Yuna listened, holding her breath. Her eyes grew huge. Daniel described the leaf, narrow, with a dark vein down the center. It smells sour when crushed. It blooms with tiny white dots at this time of year.
Una nodded slowly. She whispered the name in the local dialect. Cold star. She said yes. It grows by the stream. That her mother pulls it up and throws it away because it chokes the garden beds. Daniel said her mother was wrong, that this herb unlocks the power of the other 6, that without it, the recipe is like a hand without fingers, that with it, it works in 3 days. Una cried again, this time not from pain, from something else. Behind them, Yoon said calmly that the boy should go with the girl to her village, right now. That Yoon would take responsibility for explaining things to Teacher Park, that they could bypass the infirmary, that Yoon had an exit pass for a doctor's student. Daniel stood up. Una stood up too. She picked up the basket, pressed it to her chest. They went through the west gate. The guard looked at Una's pass and let them through without a word. Beyond the gate, a path began down the slope. The path was narrow and rocky. Una walked ahead. She knew every turn.
Daniel followed her. Jihwan's body wasn't used to long walks in the mountains. After 10 minutes, his legs began to burn. After 20, his breathing became ragged. Daniel remembered the 8 rib movements he had shown Una. He applied them to himself. His breathing evened out. This was the first real-world application of what he had learned in the hall, and it worked. Una was silent almost the entire way. She turned around only once. She asked if it was true that the Sunbay remembered helping her with the basket 2 years ago. Daniel almost said that it wasn't him who remembered, but Jihwan. He held back. He said he remembered. That Una had smiled then, that he hadn't forgotten that smile. Una turned away again. She was walking faster now. The village was small, 12 houses with thatched roofs, vegetable gardens, dry bundles of grass hanging on ropes. The air smelled of earth and the smoke of hearths. Una's house stood on the edge, the poorest one, clay walls, the window covered with oiled paper. An old woman sat on the threshold peeling onions. She looked up. She recognized Una. Then she glanced at Daniel and grew wary. Una said he was a Sonbei from the academy, that he had come to help, that he had a recipe. The woman stood up. She bowed. The bow was uncertain, rustic, not the kind required by the court's ceremonial protocol. Daniel bowed in return as he would to an equal. This surprised the woman. Una led him inside. There was a single room in the house. A woman in her 40s lay on a cot against the far wall. Her face was sallow, a thin trickle of men's from her morning cough. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was shallow. Daniel approached. He knelt down beside her. He placed 2 fingers on her wrist. Her pulse was rapid and as thin as a thread. The hall's memory suggested the name of the illness in the ancient language, winter stone in the lung. In simple cases, it takes a month to cure. In advanced cases, 6 months. If left completely untreated, there is no cure. Uni's mother's case was on the verge. Daniel stood up. He told Una what needed to be done. 6 herbs from the basket. He would bring the 7th himself. Boil them in a clay pot, not an iron one. Iron neutralizes the effect. Water from the north side of the well, where it's colder. Boil slowly over coals, not over a fire. Skim the foam 3 times. Give her a sip every 2 hours for 3 days. On the 3rd day, the cough will subside. By the 7th day, it will be gone. Una was taking notes. She had found a slate and a piece of chalk. She wrote quickly. The girl had a good memory, but she was afraid of forgetting.
Daniel went down to the stream. Cold Star grew exactly where he had described, a whole meadow. Una had never come here with this kind of attention before. She used to see the grass. Now she saw medicine. Daniel picked a bunch. He brought it back. Una brewed the first pot. Daniel sat down next to his mother.
He waited until the drink had cooled to lukewarm. He brought it to the woman's lips himself.
She took a small sip. She choked. She took another. An hour later, Una made a second pot. 2 hours later, a third. Daniel watched his mother's breathing. On the third sip of the third pot, her breathing became slightly deeper. Just a little. But Una noticed it too. She sat silently on the floor and wept, though no tears came. She just sat there with her hands folded. By evening, Daniel was getting ready to return to the academy. Una had been waiting for his pass only until sunset. Una came out to see him off. She stopped him at the path. She asked quietly how she could thank him. Daniel said there was no need to thank him. He said that once his mother was back on her feet, Una should return to the academy and continue her studies in medicine, that she had good hands and a good memory, that she would make a true healer. Una looked at him for a long time. She said she would return.
That she would study. That she would be by his side.
She said it not as a promise, but as an oath made once and for all. Daniel didn't know what to say. He walked up the path. Halfway up, he turned around. Una was still standing at the bend, a small figure with an empty basket. She waved once. He returned to the academy at sunset. Yoon was waiting at the west gate. He wasn't alone. Teacher Pak was standing beside him. Pak's face was sour. Yoon caught the boy's gaze first. He said calmly that Teacher Pak had found out about the escape and had come to investigate. Park stepped forward. He said the boy had violated the outer courtyard rule, that students do not leave the academy without being accompanied by a senior of their rank, that Yoon had taken responsibility but had not gone with them himself, that this was a breach of protocol, that Park was obliged to report it. Yoon turned his blind face toward Park. He said one word quietly. Report it. Park fell silent.
Yoon added that the boy had gone on medical orders, that an entry would be made in the healer's journal, that if Park wants to take the matter to the council, let him do so, that Yoon will answer personally. Park looked at Yoon, then at Daniel, then back at Yoon, and backed down. He bowed awkwardly. He walked off toward the teacher's wing. Yoon waited until he was out of sight. He told Daniel that Park wouldn't report it, that Park was afraid, that Park had been Jihwan's teacher for 3 years and had humiliated him for 3 years, that now Park understood that the boy he had humiliated could destroy him with a single word, that Yoon wouldn't let the boy use that word today, but that on the right day he would. The following weeks flew by. Daniel woke up before dawn. He did the 8 rib movements by the window. He went to Yoon. He learned to hold the needle. He learned to listen to the pulse. He learned to distinguish the scents of herbs the way a blind person does. Yoon turned out to be a harsh teacher. Not cruel, harsh in his demands. He said that the boy had someone else's experience in his head, but nothing in his hands, that he needed to translate that experience into his hands, that it takes years to do so, that the boy had no years to spare. Every evening, Daniel collapsed onto the mat and fell asleep instantly, and every night he returned to the hall.
Huang Jie-ho didn't come every night. Sometimes others came in his place. In the second week, a woman with a sword came, tall, dressed in Goryeo-era clothing. Her name was Seo Jihwan. 750 years since her birth, 220 since her death. She was a fencer from the southern mountains, the very one Daniel had written about in one of his early articles. Mireille sat down across from him. She said she had read the article, that the boy had described her stance correctly and had described its reason incorrectly. She said the stance was not for attack.
The stance was for protecting the child she had hidden behind her back her whole life. That her grandmother had passed the stance down to her specifically for that purpose. That the boy historian couldn't have known that. That only she and her grandmother did. Daniel listened. Mireille began to teach. Not movements, perception. How to sense the space behind you without turning around. How to maintain balance when your hands are occupied with something else. How to move so that the one you're protecting can keep up. These lessons didn't give Daniel combat power. They gave him what Juan had written about: understanding, context. By the end of the second week, a calligrapher monk appeared in the hall, a silent one, with a shaved head and slender fingers stained with ink. He said his name was Jang Il. He said he would not teach the boy to write. He said he would teach the boy to watch how they write. That the movement of the brush and the movement of the blade are one. That the breath of both is one. That if the boy learned to see the hidden martial form in calligraphy, then in the martial form he would see the hidden calligraphy. Those nights were the strangest. Daniel woke up in the morning with the feeling that he hadn't slept, but had sat for a long time in a museum. By the end of the third week, Jung began taking him on rounds. In the infirmary lay students with all kinds of breakdowns. Daniel watched. At first he was silent, then he began to speak, quietly, into Yoon's ear. This boy broke down not because of the technique, but because of his fear of his older brother. It's not the meridians that need treating. What needs treating is a conversation with his brother. This girl is breathing correctly, but the day before her breakdown she ate a poorly prepared mushroom. The mushroom isn't poisonous, but it contains a substance that constricts the channels for 8 hours. If she had trained 6 hours later, everything would have been fine. Yoon listened. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he asked for clarification. Sometimes he was silent and then went to check for himself. Every time Yoon returned from checking, his expression was the same. Calm, unsurprised, like someone who sees confirmation of what they already know. On the 21st day, Yuna appeared at the academy. She came alone, with a small bundle on her back. The guard at the west gate recognized her. He let her through. Yuna went straight to the infirmary. Yoon met her. Yuna bowed. She said her mother was well, that she was ready to work, that she was ready to learn. Yoon looked at her with blind eyes and nodded. He said there was a place for her, that she would start by sweeping the hall. Yuna wasn't offended. She understood it was a test. She swept. 3 days later, Yoon had her sort through dried herbs. After 7 days, she sorted the prepared herbal mixtures. After 10 days, she approached a patient's bed for the first time and held his head while Daniel inserted a needle. Her hands didn't tremble. Daniel noticed. Yoon noticed too. That same evening, something else happened in the infirmary. A man came into the backyard carrying water in large clay jugs. A maid followed him with a broom. Daniel was standing by the infirmary door and saw her out of the corner of his eye. A girl of about 17, tall, a braid down to her waist,
the simple gray clothes of an outer courtyard servant. She leaned the broom against the wall. She glanced around furtively and began to move. Not to sweep, to move. The third stance of the crane step. Daniel froze. The girl was doing the stance incorrectly. There was no shoulder. There was no breath. There was no proper weight distribution. But she was doing it precisely, with the precision of someone who had watched it 1,000 times and repeated it 1,000 times alone at night. The girl finished the form.
She picked up the broom. She became a servant again. She walked past the infirmary door without looking at Daniel. At the courtyard gate, she suddenly stopped. She turned around. She looked him straight in the face. Her eyes were dark and angry. She said loudly, so that everyone around could hear, that if the Sunbei wanted to watch, he should pay to do so. And she left. Yoon, standing behind Daniel, chuckled quietly. He said that was Che Sora, the cook's daughter, 17 years old, that she'd been sweeping the courtyard with a broom for 6 years, that Yoon had known about her figure for a long time, that he hadn't interfered because it wasn't his business, that the boy might want to get involved. Daniel asked who she was hiding behind her back. Yoon paused. He said he didn't understand the question. Daniel said that the woman with the sword was teaching him one thing, that there are fighters who take a stance to attack. There are those who take a stance to defend. And there are those who take a stance to defend someone who is no longer there. That Sora had exactly that stance. Yoon was silent for a long time. Then he said that Sora had a younger brother, that 3 years ago her brother fell ill and died, that Sora blames herself for not having given him the medicine in time, that after her brother's death, she began repeating the forms in the courtyard every night, that no one understood why, that Yoon understood now. Daniel thought about Sora for 2 nights. Then he went to see Yoon. He said he wanted to ask for a favor. He wanted Yoon to take Sora on as a student in herbal defense. Yoon lifted his blind face. He said that herbal defense was a formal rank for servants who assist with training, that in reality it was the right to carry a weapon, that Sora would be mocked, that her father, the cook, would be against it, that half the academy would be outraged. Daniel nodded. He said he understood. He said that Sora had been training at night with a broom for 6 years, that in another year she would break her shoulder because a broom is light, but the form requires weight, that if Yoon formally took her on, he could give her a wooden sword and set her shoulder. Yoon thought about it. He said he'd think about it some more, that they'd have to ask Sora herself, too, that you can't force someone to do good. Sora came the next morning. Yoon had summoned her through her father. The cook brought her himself. He stood nearby. The cook's face looked worried. Yoon dismissed the cook with a wave of his hand. Sora remained standing. She didn't bow. She stared at the floor. Yoon spoke calmly. He said that Seo Jihwan Sunbei had noticed her training, that he had offered to take her on as a student, that Yoon was inclined to agree, that he wanted to hear what Sora herself thought. Sora raised her head. She looked not at Yoon, but at Daniel. Her eyes were angry. She said loudly that she didn't need pity from a boy in the back row who had suddenly become a genius, that if Daniel had noticed her 2 years ago, she would have believed him, that it was too late now, that her brother was dead, that she was doing the forms for her brother, and that her brother didn't care whether she had a wooden sword or a broom. Daniel didn't move.
He let the silence hang. Then he spoke quietly. He said it wasn't out of pity. He said he'd seen her third form yesterday, that she had a mistake in her weight shift on the third step, that no one would point out this mistake to her if she trained alone, that in a year this mistake would cause a ligament under her shoulder blade to snap, that her brother, who had died, wouldn't want her to break her arm, that he himself didn't know what her brother would have wanted, but he... Sora was silent. Her face began to change. The anger faded slowly. It didn't fade completely. Somewhere inside it remained.
Sora said quietly that she agreed. Not to the Songbei, to the elder. That she would be Elder Yoon's apprentice. That she wanted only one thing from the Songbei, that he not look at her with pity. Daniel nodded. He said he wouldn't. It was the first lie he had ever told her, because he could no longer look at her without pity, but he understood why she was asking. Yoon got everything sorted out in 2 hours. Sora's documents were placed on the archivist's desk. Archivist Park Min-soo accepted the papers in silence. Daniel met her face to face for the first time. Tall, 18 years old, long fingers. Her hair was pulled back into a simple bun. Her face was calm and slightly detached. Jihwan's memory immediately brought the name to mind. Park Min-soo. The very one. The promising one. The one who had broken down 3 years ago. The archivist. Min-soo looked up. She looked at Daniel. Without curiosity, without envy, without anything. She simply looked. It was the gaze of a person for whom life had already ended. Daniel knew that look. He had seen it once in the hospital when he was writing an article on rehabilitation. Min-soo took the papers. She stamped them. She said quietly that the registration had been accepted, that the new student, Che Sora, had been enrolled in the Herbal Protection Program under the supervision of Ray Shin Yoon, that copies would be sent to the council in the morning. Daniel bowed. Min-soo responded with a slight nod. Daniel was already walking toward the door when he suddenly stopped. He turned around. He said he wanted to ask one thing. Min-soo looked up. Daniel asked if he could access her file. The records of her breakdown 3 years ago. Not out of curiosity, for possible research. Min-soo froze. Her expression didn't change, only her pupils narrowed for a moment. Then she said in an even voice that her file was in the senior student's archive, that only she and the 2 elders had access to it. That if the senpai wanted to look at it, he should submit an official request, that the request would be reviewed within a month. Daniel said he would submit one, and left. At the threshold, he heard Min-soo sigh very quietly behind him, not from fatigue, from something else. By the end of that same day, the first big wave of rumors had swept through the academy. Elder Yoon had taken a servant girl as his student. Half the students were outraged, a quarter laughed, a quarter remained silent. Kim Tae-hyun, the golden student, sent a note. The note was short. It stated that Kim Tae-hyun was challenging Seo Jihwan to a training duel in 3 days. The topic of the duel was Tae-hyun's choice. The topic would be the crane strike technique. It was revenge. Tae-hyun had chosen the technique in which he was considered the best in the academy, a technique he had been practicing for 6 years, a technique taught to him personally by one of the teachers from Moon's faction. Daniel held the note in his hand. Yoon stood beside him.
He said that Tae-hyun was acting on a hint, that the hint came from Elder Moon, that Moon couldn't kill the boy openly until he knew who was behind him, that Moon wanted to test him through Tae-hyun, that if the boy won the debate publicly, Moon would have confirmation of the threat. If he lost, Moon would have confirmation that the boy was a fluke, that both outcomes were dangerous, that the boy needed a third option. Daniel asked what kind. Yoon smiled with a blank expression. He said the boy was smart. Let him figure it out for himself. For 3 days, Daniel didn't sleep properly. More accurately, he slept, but he didn't rest in the hall. Hwang Jae-ho met him on the very first night. He sat across from him. He poured some tea. He said he'd heard about the debate, although heard wasn't quite the right word because Hwang saw everything with the same eye as Daniel himself.
Hwang said that the crane strike had 7 known variations and 3 forgotten ones. That one of the forgotten ones didn't actually involve a strike. It pertains to the refusal to strike. That Hwan had personally devised this variation at the age of 62. That after it, the students stopped fearing attackers. That they forgot it because it seemed weak to the masters. Hwan began to explain. The explanation was long. A crane does not attack when it sees a threat. A crane reveals itself to the threat. Completely. Openly. Without defense. And the threat stops because attacking a creature that offers no resistance is dishonorable. This is not a spiritual technique. It is psychological. A strike that does not exist. Daniel understood by the 3rd night. On the 4th morning, he woke up knowing. Yoon was waiting for him at the infirmary door. He said he had heard the boy's footsteps in the courtyard even before dawn, that the boy was ready. Daniel said he was ready. The day of the debate was clear. The training hall was completely full. 200 students, half the elders, junior and mid-level teachers. Kim Tae-hyun stood in the center of the circle, the white uniform of the air, hair pulled back high, hands folded, a cold face. Behind him stood one of the teachers from the Moon faction. Elder Moon himself did not come. That was worse than if he had come. Daniel entered the circle. He bowed to Tae-hyun. The bow was even. They had been taught. Tae-hyun responded casually, demonstratively. The teacher opened the debate. He announced the topic, the crane strike. He said that each student would demonstrate their own version of the technique. Then the opponent would point out the weaknesses. Then there would be a brief instructional exchange. The winner would be determined by the judges. Tae-hyun began. His crane strike was beautiful. 6 years of practice. Every movement was polished. The hall watched, holding its breath. Tae-hyun finished. He bowed. He knelt, waiting for the critique. Daniel approached. He spoke. Quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. He said that Tae-hyun Sunbae's technique was flawless in form, that there were 3 areas in it that could be improved. The first concerns the foot, the second, breathing, the third, the gaze. Regarding the foot, the technique is correct according to the 3rd-generation school, but in the founder's records, the foot is turned 8 degrees to the left. This provides better weight distribution during turns. Regarding breathing, the technique uses a short cycle. In the original, it was long. The short cycle came from combat adaptation. If the goal is training, the long one is more accurate. Regarding the gaze, the technique teaches focusing on the opponent. In the original, the gaze is defocused to see the periphery. Tae-hyun listened. His face was stony, but Daniel saw his right index finger trembling. Slightly, imperceptible to the hall. Noticeable to one who could hear a pulse. The teacher nodded. He told Daniel to demonstrate his version.
Daniel bowed. He stepped into the center and stood still. The hall fell silent. The teacher asked again if Sanbei So would begin. Daniel said he had already begun, that his version of the technique was called the crane that does not strike, that it was a forgotten variation described in the founder's personal notes, that there was no strike in it, that it consists only of a display stance, that the crane reveals itself to the opponent and the opponent stops. The hall laughed, timidly. Half the laughter stemmed from incomprehension, half from the expectation of a trick. Tae-hyun stood up. His face had changed, not stony, tense. He realized they were trying to humiliate him with something he didn't know. He asked loudly if this meant that Sanbei So was backing out of the debate. Daniel said he wasn't backing out, that he was offering Tae-hyun Sanbei the chance to attack
without restrictions, that he would demonstrate the variation in action. The teacher did not stop him. That was the teacher's mistake. Tae-hyun stepped forward and began his crane strike in earnest. 6 years of training came together in a single attack. The hall gasped. Daniel didn't move. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't change his stance. He just lowered his eyelids halfway and looked through Tae-hyun just as Seo Meyer had taught him, out of focus, with his peripheral vision. Tae-hyun raised his hand. The strike is coming from above. It's supposed to hit the shoulder. If Daniel doesn't block it, his collarbone will be broken. Tae-hyun couldn't do it. In the last 10 centimeters, his hand slowed down. Then it stopped. Tae-hyun stood with his hand raised above the motionless Daniel. His face was changing. First, bewilderment, then anger, then something else. Something very much like horror. Tae-hyun didn't understand why he couldn't strike. He lowered his hand slowly. He took a step back, and suddenly he spoke loudly so the hall could hear that he was refusing to continue, that he acknowledged Senior So's superiority in this particular dispute, that he apologized for the challenge. He bowed. The bow was deep. He turned and stepped out of the circle. The hall was silent. No one applauded. No one whistled. There was a silence that Daniel had never heard even in the hall of the sleeping master. Then one of the elders on the right slowly stood up. She bowed to Daniel. An old woman in a gray hanbok, a healer from a neighboring lineage, not from the Yoon faction nor from the Moon faction. The bow was not ceremonial. The bow was genuine. One by one, 2 more stood up. Half the elders. Only half. The other half sat motionless. Master Moon, standing behind Tae-hyun, looked at Daniel the way one looks at a snake. After the debate, Daniel went out into the courtyard. Yoon was waiting. His blind face turned toward the wind. He said quietly that he had heard everything, that the boy had found a third way out, that Tae-hyun was not humiliated because he had refused himself, that Daniel had not won because he had not attacked, that Moon would receive a report that confirmed nothing, that the boy should prepare himself, that now Moon would take the long way, that the detour would be a dirty one. The dirty path began a week later. In the morning, a new student arrived at the infirmary, a boy of about 17. He introduced himself as Cho Bin-ho. He said he had been transferred from the southern branch as part of an exchange program, that he wanted to study under Yoon. He brought a letter of recommendation signed by one of the council members.
Yoon accepted the documents. He ran his fingers over the paper. He said the letter was genuine, that Cho Bin-ho could start tomorrow. When the boy left, Yoon turned to Daniel. He said the signature on the letter belonged to a council member from Moon's camp.
That the council couldn't send students personally. That the letter was formally legal, but actually strange. That the boy should be careful with Bin-ho. That he shouldn't drink from the same cup as him. That he shouldn't sit with his back to him. That he shouldn't be left alone with him in a closed room. Daniel nodded. Bin-ho began his studies. He was polite, he was helpful, he assisted with everything. 2 days later, he offered to bring Daniel some tea. Daniel said he didn't drink tea in the afternoon. Bin-ho apologized. He brought water. Daniel didn't take the water either. Bin-ho apologized again. Daniel noticed that Sora was looking at Bin-ho the way one looks at a rat in a pantry. He approached her that evening. He asked quietly what she thought. Sora said that Bin-ho smelled wrong, that he smelled of cheap incense, the kind they don't wear at the academy, that such incense is sold in a certain quarter of the lower city where poisoners live. That her father, a cook, had taught her that when she was little. Daniel remembered. On the 3rd day, Bin-ho brought a new cup for the infirmary. He said he'd noticed the old one was cracked, that he'd bought it at the market at the foot of the mountain, that he wanted to contribute. Yoon accepted the cup. He thanked him. When Bin-ho left, Yoon turned the cup over and ran his fingers along the bottom. He said quietly that inside the clay there was a thin layer of a different color, that the clay was fired with an admixture of lead, that lead doesn't kill immediately, that it builds up in the body over months, that a person drinking from such a cup begins to lose their memory after 3 months and their strength after 6, that no doctor would connect it to the cup. Yoon placed the cup carefully on the shelf. He said it couldn't be broken now, that Bin-ho needed to see the cup on the shelf, that they needed to pretend they were drinking from it. That in the meantime, the boy should think about how to use the situation. Daniel thought about it all night. The next morning, he shared his plan. Yoon smiled with his blind face. He said the boy had come up with something similar to what he himself had been going to suggest, that the plan was good. The plan was this. Every morning in front of Bin-ho, Daniel would ostentatiously drink from the new cup, not actual tea, but warm water that looked like tea. In reality, the cup would remain untouched on the shelf, and Daniel would drink from his old one. In 2 weeks, the boy would start complaining of a slight numbness in his fingers. After 3 weeks, memory lapses. In the 4th week, weakness in the knees. All of this is feigned. Bin-ho will report it to the higher-ups. The higher-ups will be delighted. They'll let their guard down. They'll lift surveillance. At that moment, Daniel will suddenly make a public recovery, and at the same time, Yoon will present the cup to the council along with the lead analysis report. It will be a double blow. Bin-ho will be caught, his sponsor will be compromised, and the boy will show everyone that he's not such an easy target. The plan went exactly as intended. For 2 weeks, Daniel played the dying man. It wasn't difficult. Jihwan's body was already weak. Daniel just exaggerated his complaints a little. Sora hissed at him every time he moaned too convincingly, warning that he was overacting and would be found out. Yoon chuckled. Yuna, the herbalist, was genuinely worried until they explained it to her. After the explanation, she began to help. She gave Daniel the necessary herbs, which were actually mild tonics designed to make him look as if he were slowly being poisoned. Bin-ho came every morning. He watched. He put on an interested expression. One day, Daniel noticed that after visiting the infirmary, Bin-ho didn't go to the academic building, but through the small gate to the teacher's wing. More precisely, to the wing where one of the teachers from the Moon faction lived. This confirmed the connection. On the 21st day, Daniel entered the council hall. Alone, Yuna behind him. They brought two things with them, a cup and a report from the blind elder Yoon on the composition of the clay, bearing the seals of two independent elders from other lineages whom Yoon had enlisted 3 days earlier. When Daniel entered the hall, everyone saw that he was healthy. No trembling fingers, no weakness. His back was straight, his eyes were clear. Elder Moon, seated at the central table, froze for a second. Daniel bowed to the council. He said he asked to be heard. He said that 3 weeks ago, a new apprentice, Cho Bin-ho, had been sent to Elder Yoon's infirmary, that Bin-ho had given the infirmary a cup,
that the cup was made with an admixture of lead, that the lead slowly poisons whoever drinks from it, that 3 elders had confirmed the composition of the clay, that Daniel had not drunk from this cup for 3 weeks despite Bin-ho's requests, that Daniel kept a journal of daily observations of Bin-ho's behavior, that after every visit to the infirmary, Bin-ho went to the room of one of the teachers, that this teacher was Elder Moon's student, that Daniel does not accuse Elder Moon personally, that Daniel asks the council to investigate. The hall was silent. Moon smiled. The smile was slow. He said he welcomed the investigation, that he was ready to personally interrogate Bin-ho, that he was ready to personally deal with the teacher under his command if he was indeed involved. That was the right move. It was the best move. Moon was publicly sacrificing a lower-ranking member to save himself. But in this sacrifice lay something Moon hadn't foreseen.
Sora was standing in the hallway outside. She had another piece of evidence that Daniel hadn't shown in the courtroom right away. A letter. Bin-ho kept it in his room. Sora had sneaked in there the night before while Bin-ho was with the teacher. The letter was short and unsigned. It stated that surveillance of the subject was proceeding according to plan, that in 2 weeks the subject would be weakened enough to hold a public debate with him, in which the subject would lose and his reputation would be destroyed. The handwriting was unknown, but the paper was rare, from a workshop that supplies only the clan's elite. Daniel didn't show the letter in the courtroom. He didn't want to corner Moon right away. He wanted Moon to think that the matter off with minimal bloodshed, so that Moon would relax, so that the letter would become a card to be played later. When the hall emptied, Moon approached Daniel, closely. His voice was soft and pleasant. He said the boy was smart, that the boy was getting smarter every time, that Moon could see it, that Moon hoped to speak with the boy alone someday, without witnesses. Not today, someday. That the boy should think about this offer. Daniel bowed. He said he would think about it. Moon left. Yoon, standing nearby, said quietly that the boy had done the right thing by not showing the letter, that today they had won the first battle, that the war was just beginning, that the boy now had 3 weeks until the next attempt, that they needed to use those 3 weeks to strengthen the circle. Daniel nodded. He knew Yoon was right, and he knew that 2 people were still missing from this circle. The one who sat behind the archives and never looked up, and the one he had never been told about, but whom Juan had mentioned in passing the last time in the hall. The girl in white who would soon come of her own accord. A week after Bin-ho's exposure, a new figure appeared at the academy.
Daniel saw her first thing in the morning in the courtyard. A woman in a white hanbok. Tall, around 30, her hair pulled back into a neat bun, no makeup, no jewelry, just a simple silver hairpin. She walked across the courtyard with a quick, steady stride. She didn't look around. The students parted of their own accord. Daniel didn't know her, but Yoon, standing nearby, quietly said her name. So Hae-jin, 32 years old, an elder curator, assigned by the council to monitor the case of Seo Jihwan. That is, she had effectively been assigned to determine whether he was an impostor. Hae-jin stopped in front of the infirmary. She bowed to Yoon with precision. Yoon returned the bow. Hae-jin turned to Daniel. She looked at him calmly, coldly, expressionless. She said she was starting work today, that she would observe the student for 4 hours a day, that the observation would include study, training, and patient consultations,
that she asked the senior not to change his usual behavior because of her presence. Daniel bowed. He said he was grateful for the honor of being observed by the elder. Hae-jin nodded once. She entered the infirmary. She sat down in a corner on a low stool. She didn't move for 4 hours. Daniel worked. He saw patients. He inserted needles. He talked with Yuna, who was now helping with everything. He felt a gaze on his back, cold and constant. After 4 hours, Hae-jin stood up. She bowed to Yuna. She left. She didn't say a word. The next day, the same thing. And the day after that. And 2 days later. A week later, Yoon quietly told Daniel that Hae-jin was the youngest elder in the history of the White Heron, that she had been accepted into the council at 28, that she had no family, no students, no friends, that her mother had died when Hae-jin was 10, that her father had been a mediocre master and had broken down on the techniques that many break down on. That Hae-jin had lived only for techniques ever since. That her loneliness was known to the entire clan. That they called her the White Heron without a nest. On the 10th day of observation, Hae-jin spoke for the first time. It happened at the end of the day when the infirmary had nearly emptied. Yoon had gone to check the storeroom. Yoon, the herbalist, had gone to gather evening herbs. Hae-jin and Daniel remained in the room. Hae-jin sat in the corner. Daniel was putting away his tools. Hae-jin said quietly that the boy had a strange habit, that every time before he picked up a needle, he held it up to his ear. She listened, that none of the well-known healers did that she was curious where it came from. Daniel froze. He hadn't noticed he was doing it himself. He thought about it and realized that yes, he did. Every time. The memory of Zheng, the calligrapher from the hall. He had said that metal rings differently in different hands, that if the hand trembles, the ringing is one way. If the hand is steady, the ringing is another. That the needle should be inserted only when the ringing is steady. Daniel turned to Hae-jin. He told half the truth. He said that he had read in an old book that metal rings differently depending on the state of the hand, that he had started testing it on himself, that it works. Hae-jin was silent. She asked which book. Daniel named a 14th century work by the author Zheng the calligrapher. The book existed. Daniel had seen a copy of it himself in a museum in his past life. It wasn't at the academy. Hae-jin wrote the title down on a small tablet. She said she would find it, that she would read it, that she would return to the matter. She stood up. She bowed. She left. 3 days later, she returned with the book. She placed it on Daniel's desk. She said she had found it, in the archives, on the very bottom shelf. It had lain untouched for 320 years.
She said she'd read it.
that there wasn't a word in there about listening to the needle. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know where to look. Hei Jin stood before him. Her face was calm. Her eyes were attentive. She said she hadn't come to accuse. She said she'd come to understand. That the boy's technique was correct. That the boy's results were impossible. That the boy's source of knowledge wasn't a book. That there were rumors at the academy about spirits. That Hei Jin didn't believe in spirits, but that she believed the boy knew things he shouldn't know, and that she wanted to know where he got them from. Daniel was silent. He thought for a moment. He realized he had 3 options: lie again and lose her forever, stay silent and leave the question open, or tell the truth. Yoon had once taught in the hall that there are moments when the truth is stronger than any lie, and that one must recognize those moments. This was one of them. Daniel said quietly that he would propose a trade, that he would tell the truth. If Hei Jin gave her word that she wouldn't report it to the council until she was convinced herself that the boy wasn't dangerous. Hei Jin thought for a moment. She nodded. She said she gave her word, that her word was known throughout the clan, that no one had ever questioned it. Daniel sat down on the mat. He motioned for her to sit across from him. Hei Jin sat down. Daniel told her. Not everything, just the main points. He said he had dreams, that in his dreams masters spoke to him, that these masters had once been living people, that they were teaching him, that he didn't choose what to learn, that he had no spirits, that he had no magic, that he had only the memories of other people that had somehow found their way into his head. Hei Jin listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't change. When Daniel finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said something strange. She said that her father had said something similar before he died. That her father had seen an old man in a blue hanbok in a dream. That her father thought he was going mad. That the doctors said it was delirium before death. That Hei Jin had never told anyone about this. That she had believed her father was truly delirious. That now she wasn't sure. Hei Jin stood up. She bowed. She said she would keep her word, that she would report to the council that the boy was a gifted student with an unusual aptitude for understanding ancient texts without going into detail, that she was asking the boy for one thing: if a man named Sogon Uk ever appeared in his dreams, he should tell her. That was her father. Daniel nodded. Hei Jin left. After she left, Daniel sat on the mat for a long time. Yoon returned from the storeroom. He immediately realized that something had happened. He didn't ask. He sat down beside him. He said quietly that Hei Jin doesn't go to the hall, but that there is a seed within her, that the seed is from the same era, that the boy may have found the 6th candle in his circle. A month passed. A fragile silence settled over the academy. Moon took no overt action. Binho was expelled and sent to the southern branch under supervision. The teacher whom Moon had sacrificed was demoted to assistant archivist and transferred to the far wing. Everyone around was waiting for Moon's next move. Hei Jin came to the infirmary every day. Gradually, she stopped sitting in the corner. She began to help. At first, she silently handed instruments. Then she asked quiet questions. Then she started staying for lunch. Yuna, the herbalist, accepted her cautiously. Sora was suspicious.
He-jin barely spoke to Sora. There was something invisible between them. Perhaps envy, perhaps recognition. Sora was who He-jin could have been if she had been born a servant. He-jin was who Sora could have become had she been born into the right family. They both sensed it, and both kept silent about it.
In the middle of the second month, Yuna the herbalist came to Daniel. Not in the morning to the infirmary, in the evening, to his room in the outer courtyard. She knocked. She came in. She sat down across from him. She brought a small bundle. She unwrapped it. Inside was a piece of white silk embroidered with a single thread. The pattern was strange. Not flowers, not cranes, 7 dots connected by thin lines. Yuna said quietly that she had been embroidering at night, that she had seen the pattern in a dream, that she didn't understand what it meant, that she wanted to show it to her senbei. Daniel looked at the pattern and froze. 7 dots. 6 were arranged in a circle, the 7th in the center, just the way the candles had been lit in the hall the last time he was there. 6 candles in a circle, the 7th in the center. Juan had said there were 7 candles, that one had gone out. Daniel asked Yuna if she had seen a person in her dream. Yuna thought for a moment. She said she didn't remember, that her dream was dark, and that in the darkness there was light in the form of dots, and that one dot was slowly fading. That she woke up feeling anxious and picked up a needle and thread. Daniel felt his hands growing cold. Yuna wasn't in the hall. Yuna didn't know what the hall was. But Yuna had seen the same thing. Yoon, to whom Daniel showed the silk the next morning, was silent for a long time. Then he said that there are mentions in old books of those who resonate with the memory carrier, that there are few such people, that they usually know nothing of their own, that their dreams simply become brighter when near someone who remembers. That Yuna might be one of them. That this explains why she happened to be nearby right now, and that this means the circle is gathering for a reason. That everyone who comes to Daniel comes because something within him resonates. That same evening, Daniel saw Min-soo from the window. The archivist was walking slowly across the courtyard, with a large stack of scrolls. One scroll fell out. She bent down to pick it up. Her hands were trembling. Min-soo had been looking worse these past few days. Daniel knew why. It had been 3 years since her breakdown, exactly 3 years this week. Daniel had submitted an official request for her file a month ago. The request was denied without explanation. Daniel wasn't surprised. But in the hall, he worked on it. Every night, Juan sat with him, and they analyzed exactly what had broken in Min-soo back then. Juan found records in his memory, records of other students broken in the same way over the past centuries. Juan couldn't heal her through Daniel right away. He could provide a diagram for reverse tuning. No one had ever tried to restore broken meridians. It was believed that it was like trying to put a broken jug back together. Juan said that a jug really couldn't be put back together. But that meridians weren't a jug. Meridians were water that had flowed through a channel. The channel was destroyed. But the water can be directed through a new channel. And after many years, the new channel will become just like the old one. Daniel worked on the diagram for 6 months. At first, at night in the hall. Then during the day, he tested it on tree bark, on bamboo splinters, on a single mouse that lived in the corner of the infirmary. The mouse was old and lame. After 3 weeks of working on the diagram, the mouse stopped limping. Daniel knew the mouse wasn't a person. But he also knew the principle worked. On the anniversary of Min-soo's breakdown, Daniel came to see her in the archives late one evening. He brought a rolled-up scroll. Minsu looked up. Her face was as detached as ever. She asked what he wanted. Daniel placed the scroll on the table. He said it was for her. He said she had been in the archives for 3 years now. He said he'd filed a request for her case, that the request had been denied, that he'd reconstructed her case using other records and old Juan's description in his dreams, that the scroll contained a diagram, not a cure, a diagram of how to reopen the meridians along a new path, that it would require a year of daily work, that he couldn't guarantee the result, that the probability, according to his calculations, was about 60%, that if she agreed, he would help her every day, that if she refused, he would burn the scroll today and never return to this conversation again. Minsu took the scroll. She unrolled it. She read for about 20 minutes. Daniel sat across from her in silence. Minsu's lips began to tremble, not from tears, from something deeper. She read to the end. She looked up, and for the first time in 3 years, there was something in her eyes. She said quietly that there were phrases in this scroll that she had only read in her grandfather's personal diary, that her grandfather had been a disciple of the clan 40 years ago, that her grandfather had died when she was 5, that she had never shown the diary to anyone, that in the diary her grandfather had written exactly this phrase about the watercourse. Daniel didn't understand. He didn't know her grandfather. Juan had never mentioned her grandfather in the hall. Minsu looked at him for a long time. She said she believed him, that she agreed, that she was ready to work for a year, that she was ready for 2, that she was ready for as long as it took. Daniel nodded. He asked if he could tell her the truth. Minsu said yes. Daniel told her everything. Not just half, like He-jin, the whole story, about his past life, about the car in the river, about the hall, about the 6 candles, about the 7th, about the fact that he wasn't the first, that there had been 6 others before him, and they hadn't returned. Minsu listened calmly, without interrupting. When he finished, she said only one sentence, that her grandfather had written in his diary that he dreamed of meeting someone who remembered, that now her grandfather would be happy. And she stood up and bowed, low, the way one bows to a teacher, not a senpai. 2 weeks after Minsu began working according to the plan, what Yoon had predicted happened at the academy. Moon took a roundabout approach, this time a more subtle one. In the morning, a notice appeared in the academic building. The Council of 12, by majority decision, appoints an inter-clan embassy to the Green Stone Gate. The purpose of the embassy is to exchange treaties regarding the Crane Step. 3 members are departing from the White Heron clan, Elder Moon Hosuk, a mid-level teacher, and 1 inner court student to serve as a scribe. The student's name, Seo Jihwan. Daniel read the announcement twice. The paper was thick. The ink was fresh. The council's seal was at the bottom. Everything was by the book. Everything was legal. It was a trap in its purest form. The road to the Green Stone Gate led through a mountain pass. The pass was considered dangerous. 6 travelers had perished there over the past 10 years, all attributed to avalanches and cliffs. No suspicions, no investigations, just the mountains. Daniel would be alone at the embassy with Elder Moon and his teacher amid the snow and cliffs. Yoon could not go.
Yoon was a healer elder, and his duties kept him tied to the academy. As a guardian, Haejin had no right to leave the clan's borders with her ward. The charter forbade it. Min-soo was not a student. Sora was a servant. No one could go. Daniel stood by the announcement for a long time. Students gathered behind him. They whispered. Half looked on with envy. A mission to the gates of the strangers was considered an honor. Half looked on with understanding. They knew the boy would not return. Yoon found him an hour later. He placed a hand on his shoulder.
He didn't say a word at first. He led him aside, to a quiet corner of the courtyard by the old well. Only there did he speak. That he had heard. That refusal was not an option. That a student's refusal of the council's order meant expulsion from the academy and loss of status. That Moon had taken everything into account. That the council would not allow the boy to simply be locked away in the academy. That Moon was now making a move that looked like ordinary clan work, and no independent elder would be able to find fault with it. That the boy had 3 days before his departure. That he had to make the most of those 3 days. Daniel nodded. He said quietly that he understood. Yoon looked at him with blind eyes. He said that this was the first real test, that up until now it had all been games, that in the mountains the games end. Daniel went to the infirmary. He sat down on a low bench by the far wall. He thought. He went over in his head everyone he knew, everything he had. Everything that might come in handy. Sora approached. She brought water. She set it down in front of him. She didn't leave. She stood nearby. She said quietly that she'd heard about the announcement, that she would go with him. Daniel looked up. He said it wasn't possible. That there were only 3 approved names at the embassy, that there was no way to add her to the list. Sora smiled, a bit crookedly. She said that Sonba didn't know the rules very well, that there were 3 spots at the embassy and one of them was for a teacher, that the teacher had a servant, that the servant traveled alongside him and his name didn't need to be on the lists because a servant was a thing, not a person, that Sora would go as the servant of the appointed teacher, that the teacher wouldn't be able to refuse because he's from Moon's faction, and Moon doesn't want to draw unnecessary attention to the embassy, that Sora knows this teacher personally and knows where he has breakfast, that her father, the academy's chef, has his own ways of quietly resolving such matters, that her father owed the teacher 2 favors from last winter, that Sora would collect that debt herself. Daniel looked at her for a long time. He said it was risky, that she could be exposed, that if anything went wrong, Moon would kill her first. Sora shrugged. She said she'd been exposed her whole life, that she was tired of it, that this time she would be useful, that a servant can go where a student cannot. A servant can eavesdrop at the door, can rummage through things, can ride at the back of the column and see everyone, that you can't send a single boy alone with an elder, that neither the Sonbi nor the Circle would forgive this. Daniel didn't argue. He realized he couldn't win the argument, and that Sora was right. Yuna the herbalist came to him herself that evening in his room in the outer courtyard. She knocked. She came in. She sat down on the mat across from him. Her face was serious. Not like usual. She brought a small bundle. She unwrapped it. Inside lay a piece of thick paper with her neat handwriting. She said she had a cousin, a maternal cousin, that he ran a tea house in a small village at the foot of the eastern slope of the pass, that Yuna would write him a letter that very day,
that her cousin would meet Daniel if goes wrong, that her cousin has a horse, that the horse is a fast young chestnut mare, that her cousin has 2 children and won't ask unnecessary questions, that Una would explain to him what was needed. Daniel asked why she was doing this. Una looked at him calmly. She said that her mother was alive thanks to the Sonbei, that her mother's brother had died when Una was 7, also in these very mountains, that those who have no help down below perish in the mountains, that the Sonbei would have help, that she would write the letter at night, that she would deliver it in the morning. This was the second piece of help.
He-jin found out about the embassy that evening from Daniel himself. He came to her rooms in the north wing. He knocked. He-jin opened the door. Her face was the same as always, calm, but there was something in her eyes. Daniel said she had found out. He-jin nodded. She said she had tried to get the council to change the composition, that she had met with 3 elders personally, that she had been refused 3 times, that her hands were tied, that the curator had no right to overturn the council's decision, that the curator had only the right to observe, that He-jin hated that word now more than ever. She said there was one thing she could give. She went into her room. Daniel stayed at the door. He-jin returned with a small silk handkerchief. She unfolded it. Inside lay a glass vial about a finger's length long. The liquid inside was light green, thick. He-jin said it was her personal antidote, that her mother had taught her a single recipe before she died, that the recipe worked against the clan's 7 most common poisons, including 2 favored by the True Transmission faction, that there was only 1 vial, that there would be no second one, that her mother had spent 3 months making that vial, that He-jin had made it herself for the first time after her mother's death at the age of 16, that it had taken her half a year, that she no longer has either that kind of patience or those herbs, that the boy should drink it immediately if he feels the first signs, a burning sensation in his throat, a heaviness in his fingers, a strange sweetness in his mouth that shouldn't be there. It was more than a gift. It was a part of her own life, perhaps the last. Daniel accepted the vial in silence. He couldn't find the right words. He-jin said quietly that words weren't necessary, that the boy should simply return, that if he returned, that would be gratitude enough. Daniel bowed, deeply, not as a student to an elder, like one person to another.
He-jin returned the bow. Min-soo brought something else the next morning. She brought a scroll, a heavy one, rolled up tightly. She said she'd been copying it for 3 nights, that she hadn't eaten well, that she hadn't slept well, that she had no regrets. On the scroll was a map of a mountain pass, not the official one kept in the training division's archives, but another one, 200 years older. Min-soo had found it on the very bottom shelf in the far corner of the archives, in a bundle that no one had touched since her own grandfather died. The map marked things that weren't on the new maps: drinking water sources, places where wolves were found, old shepherds' huts, and 2 trails. 2 trails that didn't appear on any modern map. Min-soo said that only the shepherds of the local villages knew these trails and had forgotten them 200 years ago when the last shepherd died. That one of them bypassed the most dangerous spot from above along the ridge, that this trail was steep and accessible only in dry weather, that the other bypassed it from below through a wooded gorge, that this trail was longer but safer, that Min-soo had marked the exits of both trails with a red pattern, that the boy should memorize the pattern by heart,
The pattern resembled the sweep of a crane's wing. Daniel stared at the map for about 20 minutes, memorizing it. Min-soo sat in silence. When he finished, he rolled up the scroll and put it in his inside pocket. He said he thanked her. Min-soo looked at him and said one thing: that 40 years ago, in her house, her grandfather had told her mother that the day would come when someone would open the old maps again. That Min-soo hadn't believed it. That now she believed it. That the boy must return alive. Daniel nodded. And one last thing. The very night before departure, Daniel entered the hall. Jihwan was waiting, but this time he wasn't sitting with tea. He was standing by the far wall. His face was serious. Not angry. Worried. He said he'd heard the plan. He said the boy was facing his first real test, that Jihwan wouldn't be able to protect him in the hall, that there was no protection in the hall, only knowledge. But he wanted to pass on one last thing before leaving, a breathing technique for when falling. He said that in the mountains, people fall often, that most fall incorrectly and break themselves, that there is a way to fall so that the body does not shatter upon impact, that Jihwan had devised the technique himself at the age of 72 because he himself had fallen off a cliff in the southern mountains and miraculously survived, that for 2 weeks afterward he analyzed every movement that had saved him and wrote it down. He said he would demonstrate it now. Jihwan demonstrated, not with words. He performed the movement himself. He slid down as if from a horse. His side touched the floor. A roll. A second. His breathing during the first contact was unique. Not an inhale. Not an exhale. A half pause. Only that way did the impact not transfer to his internal organs. Daniel repeated it 3 times. On the 3rd try, he got it right. Jihwan nodded. He said that would be enough for one time, that it would be cold in the mountains and the boy wouldn't be able to repeat the training, that the body would remember, that Jihwan himself believed in it. In the morning, Daniel went out into the courtyard with a small bag. Inside were spare clothes, writing supplies, Hae-jin's vial sewn into the lining, Min-soo's map in the inner pocket, a letter from Yuna to her cousin in a side pouch, dried herbs that Yuna had given him for various occasions, an old chipped cup from the infirmary for good luck. Sora was already waiting at the west gate, dressed as a servant. A coarse gray dress, a kerchief on her head, a bundle on her back. She didn't approach Daniel. She stood 3 paces behind him, as a servant should. Only her eyes revealed that she was there. Elder Moon appeared at the gate in a white traveling cloak. A friendly face. His gray hair neatly combed. A teacher from his faction stood beside him. The very one. Daniel recognized him immediately. Of medium height, lean, his face scarred from old training. His name was Cho Gideong. Horses. 3 riding horses and 2 pack horses, 2 porters, a small party. Moon smiled at Daniel. He said the journey would be long, that he hoped for interesting conversations along the way, that he hadn't been to Greenstone in many years and was glad to be heading there again, that the boy should view the trip as an opportunity to see the world beyond the academy walls. Daniel bowed. He said he was grateful for the opportunity to accompany them, that he would try to be useful as a scribe. They rode out through the north gate. Yoon stood at the west gate, his blind face turned to watch them go. Hae-jin was at the north gate. Yuna and Min-soo were on the main staircase of the academic building. Everyone was silent. Everyone was watching. Daniel looked back once. He committed the scene to memory, and he drove on. The road led down the mountain, familiar, the same one he had traveled down a month ago with Yoon to her village. Only now they passed the turnoff to the village and drove on, northward. By noon on the first day, they were at the foot of the mountain. By evening, in the first village. Moon ordered dinner in the inn's common room. He poured tea for Daniel first, then a second cup for himself, the teacher third. Daniel thanked him, brought the cup to his lips, didn't drink, pretended to drink. He set the cup down. Moon smiled. He said the boy was cautious, that it was good, that the cautious live to a ripe old age. Daniel nodded. He said he had only recently learned to be cautious, that it wouldn't hurt. Moon laughed quietly. The laugh was unpleasant, dry, without warmth. Master Che didn't laugh. He stared into his cup. The second day passed quietly. They rode through the foothills. The air grew colder. The trail climbed. By evening on the second day, they stopped in a village at the very edge of the ascent. On the third day, they entered the mountains for real. The air turned biting, fog at the edges of the trail. The trail was narrow. To the left, a steep cliff. To the right, a drop of about 40 paces down to a rocky gorge. Moon rode in front, Teacher Cho behind him. Daniel was in the middle. Sora brought up the rear like a servant. The porters with the cargo brought up the rear. At the narrowest point of the trail, just before a turn, Teacher Cho suddenly reined in his horse. He let Daniel ride ahead. This was a breach of protocol. The order required that the teacher ride ahead of the student on dangerous sections. Daniel understood instantly, right then. Sora at the rear saw it too. She moved sharply forward along the trail, too sharply for a servant. The porters looked back at her movement. Teacher Cho behind her raised his hand. In his hand was a short pole with a heavy pommel. He swung it at Daniel's back. Daniel didn't look back. He wouldn't have had time. He applied what Juan had taught him. Not evasion, a fall. He slid off the horse sideways toward the very edge of the cliff. The staff passed through the air where his back had been. The blow missed. Daniel's horse jerked. The teacher lost his balance on his own horse. Daniel was falling. Not down the cliff. Down the slope between the rock and the trail. The snowy slope dropped at an angle of about 50 degrees. His side touched the snow. A roll. A half-second hold of his breath. A second roll. Juan had taught him correctly. The snow slowed his descent. Jihwan's body didn't break. Daniel slid down another 10 meters and came to a stop at a rock ledge. Sora had already jumped off her horse. She tossed the servant's bundle aside. From under her jacket, she pulled out the wooden sword that Yoon had secretly given her before they left. The sword had iron fittings along the edge, a serious weapon, though not a cripply. She stood between the cliff and the teacher. She shouted down at Daniel to leave. Teacher Che looked at her from his horse. His face was contorted, not with rage, with surprise. He hadn't expected the servant to be armed. Moon turned his horse around. His face was no longer friendly, cold. He told the teacher that the plan had changed, that they had to finish it cleanly, that they couldn't leave any witnesses, not even the servant, that the porters would be paid extra later for their silence. The porters froze. One of them quietly began to back away down the trail. The other stared at Sora with his mouth agape. Daniel stood up in the snow about 15 meters below the trail.
He pulled the Minsu map from his inside pocket. He unfolded it quickly. He figured out where he was.
30 paces east of the trail, a 200-year-old lower shepherd's path began, the very safest one, through the wooded gorge. He shouted to Sora to jump. Sora looked at Moon. She looked at the teacher and jumped without hesitation. She slid down the snow to Daniel in 10 seconds. She got to her feet, sword in her right hand, snow on her cheek, eyes burning. Master Che set off after them. He dismounted. He began to descend. It was difficult. With a pole in his hand, the pole hindered him. The snow was deeper than he had expected. Daniel and Sora were already running down the slope toward the eastern side. The master was falling behind. Moon didn't follow. He stayed on the trail. He knew he couldn't catch up from below. He knew that in the forest ravine, wolves would catch up to him or he'd lose their trail. He shouted something to the teacher. The teacher didn't hear or didn't understand. He kept descending. Daniel and Sora reached the start of the shepherd's trail 20 minutes later. The trail was barely visible under the snow, but Daniel remembered the pattern of a crane's wing. He found the first marker stone, then the second. The trail began to wind down and east into the forest. The snow was deep, knee-deep in some places, thigh-deep in others. Sora walked ahead, sword in her right hand. In her left, she held a long branch like a cane to check for solid ground beneath the snow. Daniel followed her, Minsu's map in his pocket. Every 100 steps, he checked it. The crane wing pattern repeated on the marker stones. The old shepherds knew what they were doing. Teacher Chui made his way down the slope, heavily and slowly. He was catching up, but not as fast as they were. He was following their tracks in the snow. Sora knew the mountains, not these mountains. But she had known any mountains underfoot since childhood, when she would run barefoot from the kitchen into the hills behind the academy. She knew how not to sink into the snow. She knew how to read the wind. She knew where there was a snow cornice and where there was a thick cushion of snow. Daniel knew from the map that the lower trail led east toward the village at the foot of the mountain, to that very village where Yuna's cousin lived, with his tea house and horse. It was about a 10-hour walk through a wooded gorge to the village. They walked all day. The moon came out after midnight. It shone coldly and evenly. The snow under the moon was silver. The teacher fell behind by dawn. Either he'd lost the trail in the dark or he'd gone back to Moon. Daniel turned around once and looked back for a long time. He didn't see anyone. He told Sora quietly that they could slow down. Sora didn't slow down right away. She said it would be better to walk for another hour. That predators also come out at dawn. They walked for another hour, then another. Sora was the first to allow herself to stop. She sat down in the snow at the roots of a large pine tree, her back against the trunk. She was breathing heavily. She laid her sword down beside her. Daniel sat down next to her. He took the dried herbs Yoon had given him out of his bag. He brewed them in a flask with slightly warm water from his own supply, not hot. There was no fire. A fire would give them away to any pursuer right now. He gave it to Sora. She drank it. She grimaced. She said it was bitter. She said she hadn't drunk anything like that in a long time. She said that when she was a child, her mother used to give her these herbs when she was sick, that her mother had died when Sora was 11, that no one made such herbal concoctions anymore, that Yoon knew the recipe, that her mother had done the same. Daniel suddenly realized he knew almost nothing about Sora. That for these past 2 months, he had known her only as a student with a sword and angry eyes. that he had never once asked about her life. He felt ashamed. He asked her now, simply, quietly, who her mother was, what her brother's name was, what had happened. Sora was silent for a minute. Then she began to tell him, not all at once, piece by piece. As they walked on, whenever they stopped to rest, her mother was a herbalist in a village near the clan's western borders. Her name was Cho Min Ha. She was quiet and strong. She married a cook out of poverty when the village suffered a famine and there was nothing to feed her younger brothers. The cook wasn't mean, but he wasn't loving either. His name was Cho Bok. Mother brought little Sora, who was 7, and her younger brother, whose name was Nam Su, to the academy. Nam Su was 4. The 4 of them lived in a tiny room behind the academy's kitchen, 3 steps wide, 5 steps long. Her mother continued to gather herbs on weekends in the hills. She sold them at the lower market. She saved up copper coin by copper coin, hoping someday to rent a corner with a window from the academy for the children. Sora didn't remember a single window from her childhood, only the ceiling above the cot. Her mother fell ill after 2 years at the academy. Her lungs. That very winter stone that Daniel later saw in Yuna's mother. They treated her mother poorly because she wasn't part of the clan's daughter families. Her turn came slowly. They gave her medicine through third parties. Her mother faded away quietly. She didn't complain. She prepared herbal infusions for her daughter and son herself as long as she could. When she couldn't, Sora brewed them herself, following her instructions. Her mother died one spring night when Sora was 11. Namsu was 8. The cook, Choi Bok, cried for 1 day. On the second, he returned to work. 4 years later, her brother fell ill with the same disease as their mother. Sora begged the cook to take her brother to the village to see a herbalist she knew who had the remedy. The cook said there was no money for the trip, that there were doctors at the academy too. The doctors refused. They said servants were treated in a separate queue, that there were more important patients, that her brother would have to wait. Her turn came 2 weeks later. Her brother died the day before his appointment. Sora was 15. Ever since then, she practiced forms in the courtyard every night, not because she wanted to be a fighter, because if she knew combat forms, she could have forced the doctors to go to her brother. Strength was her only idea of justice. 6 years since then, every night, without a break, with a broom, with a stick, with whatever came to hand. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When Sora finished, he said quietly that he understood. That in his hometown, he had seen many times how poor families lost their children because medicine was expensive. That Sora's anger was justified. That his own anger at the academic system was also justified. That now they were both part of that system, and that made it twice as painful. Sora looked at him strangely. She asked what he meant by back in his hometown. Daniel realized he'd let it slip. He thought. He realized that after this night, there was no point in hiding anything from Sora. That Sora had followed him over the pass with a wooden sword against an armed teacher. That you don't lie to people like that. He told her. Not as thoroughly as Min Su, just the main points. That he wasn't entirely Seo Jihwan. That Seo Jihwan had always been with him, and now he and Daniel were one person. But that Daniel had come from another place, from a world where Gion didn't exist, where there were books and machines and cities made of glass, where he had been a scholar of history, where he studied precisely those masters who now come to him in his dreams. That he doesn't explain everything because he doesn't understand it himself. that he had parents, brothers, a life, and it ended when he fell asleep at the wheel 3 months ago. That he trusts Sora with the truth because Sora risked her life for him on the pass. Sora listened. She didn't interrupt once. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. She walked ahead on the path and remained silent. Daniel had already begun to think he shouldn't have told her, that he'd scared her, that now she would look at him as if he were a stranger. Then Sora stopped. She turned around. She said something strange. She said she'd suspected something was wrong anyway, that the Jihwan she'd known for 6 years at the academy had been quiet and sleepy. He'd often cry quietly at night so no one would hear, that the Jihwan of today speaks and looks like an adult.
That she thought the boy had suddenly grown up from being hit on the head with a scroll on the first day. That she now understands he didn't grow up in a week, but over the course of his entire past life. That it doesn't matter. That Sora followed the one who is by her side now, and the one by her side now is the one who teaches her to wield a sword and who saved her father from disgrace on the day her mother died without help. Because if Daniel had been at the academy back then, perhaps her mother would still be alive. Sora said this and turned back. She walked on. Daniel stood there for a second. Then he caught up. They walked on in silence, but the silence had changed. By noon, they reached the foothills. The forest thinned out. The snow was shallower. The air was warmer. Under their feet was now earth, not a cushion of snow. Yuna's cousin's village was an hour's walk away. They arrived. The village was called Quiet Stream. 20 households, houses with tiled roofs.
On the second house on the right was a sign with a teapot drawn on it. A tea house. His cousin turned out to be a large, silent man in his 40s. His name was Han Ducho. 2 children ran out to meet him. His wife called out from the back of the yard. Ducho looked at the ragged boy and the thin girl with a wooden sword and understood everything at once without words. He led them into the house. He closed the door. Daniel handed him Yuna's letter. Dujo read it. Once, then a second time, more slowly. He said quietly that Yuna had written to him about the Sonbei a month ago in her first letter after her mother had recovered, that she had asked him, if necessary, to help the Sonbei as he would help a family member, that Dujo had been surprised then, that he wasn't surprised now. He silently led Daniel and Sora to the kitchen. His wife served them a hot meal, rice porridge with herbs. Real hot tea, the first in 2 days. Dujo went into the barn. He returned 10 minutes later. He said the horse was ready, that he'd provided 2 horses, not 1, that Yuna had said 2, that he wouldn't ask why, that he would warn the neighbors and keep quiet about the 2 guests, that it would be better to take the route back to the academy not through the pass, but from the south through the Silk Wind Valley. It was 4 days longer, but safer, that people in the valley knew him and would let his horses through without question. Daniel thanked him. He took out the wallet Yun had given him. He wanted to pay. Dujo pushed his hand away. He said that Yun was his cousin, that her mother had once saved his own daughter from a fever for free, that in their family debts are repaid with favors, not silver. Daniel and Sora rested for 3 hours, no more. Ducho insisted. He said that the sooner they left, the less chance there was that one of the neighbors would tell on them. By evening, they set off. Ducho saw them off to the edge of the village. He said one thing as a farewell, that when the boy returned to the academy, he should convey his older cousin's regards to Yun, that he was proud of her.
Daniel nodded. They rode south. The road ran along the river, then it climbed into the hills, then it descended again. They slept 2 hours a day. They changed horses every 6 hours. Sora turned out to be a good rider. Daniel was a poor one. Jihwan's body wasn't used to sitting in the saddle. By the 3rd day, his back had turned into one solid ache. Sora silently placed her cloak under his saddle. It was the first act of tenderness Sora had allowed herself. Without words, without pity, just a cloak under the saddle. By evening on the 5th day, they saw the roofs of the academy in the valley, the familiar dark contours, the tower of the academic building, smoke rising from the infirmary. Daniel pulled on the reins. He said he wasn't sure if they should return openly, that Moon had already reported that the boy and the servant had perished in the mountains,
that their appearance alive would put Moon in a losing position, but would also give him time to react. Sora said there was no choice, that they couldn't survive in the mountains, that Yoon was waiting for them, that it was better to arrive openly and loudly than secretly and quietly, that Moon wouldn't then have time to concoct a lie, that surprise was their only weapon. Daniel agreed. They entered the academy through the west gate. The guard at the gate saw Daniel. He opened his mouth. His face went pale. He didn't say a word. He bowed. He let them through, and immediately rushed to the bell. One strike, an alarm. Yoon came out to meet them 10 minutes later. He already knew. The blind man's face was turned toward them. He was walking quickly, without a cane. He said quietly that he had heard the boy's hooves from half a mile away, that he couldn't believe his ears, that he had waited 4 days, that Moon had returned yesterday alone with Teacher Cho, that Moon had announced to the council that Seo Jihwan and his servant had perished on the pass as a result of a sudden avalanche, that the council had accepted the report without question, that Daniel's sentence was now public because a dead student must not return, that Moon was now sleeping peacefully, that the boy would enter the hall tomorrow morning. Investigation. That the verdict for Daniel is now public because a dead student must not return. That Moon is sleeping peacefully now. That the boy will enter the council hall tomorrow morning, and Moon will wake up to a very restless day. Yoon stepped close. He placed his hands on Daniel's shoulders, then on Sora's shoulders. He said that both were alive, that this was the main thing, that he would get through the rest. Daniel didn't sleep in his room that night. There was no point. Yoon had quietly gathered everyone in the infirmary before midnight. The doors were locked from the inside. The windows were draped with thick fabric. Yoon the herbalist brought hot tea made from new herbs she had gathered herself while the master was away. Min-soo brought papers, a stack of documents, records, minutes. Hae-jin was the last to arrive, wearing a white cloak, quietly, without unnecessary movements. Sora stood by the door with her sword. She didn't sit down. She didn't let go of the hilt. They talked until dawn. The plan wasn't complicated. It wasn't supposed to be. In the morning, Daniel would enter the council chamber during the General Assembly scheduled for 1 hour after sunrise. He would not enter alone. Yoon would lead the way as an elder with the right to enter any council meeting. Hae-jin would be on the left as the guardian of his ward. Min-soo would be on the right as the archivist, bringing documents upon request. All 3 were elders curators or their equivalents with voting rights. Sora and Yuna would remain outside the door, ready to enter at a signal.
Daniel would not accuse Moon directly.
He would stand in the hall and say that he had returned from the embassy, that he would explain the circumstances of what had happened at the pass, that he is not making any accusations, that he is asking the council to investigate on its own. That is enough. The council will not be able to ignore the living boy whom Moon declared dead. And then the council will have two options: either to acknowledge that Moon was mistaken in his report and demand an explanation, or to launch an investigation. In either case, Moon's position is crumbling. Min Soo has prepared copies of all the documents that might be needed: the infirmary log with the entry sending Sora as a student, not a servant; the letters from Binho that Sora found 2 months ago; records from the archives about 6 people who went missing over the past 20 years at that same pass. Each document was rolled up separately and signed. By dawn, everything was ready. Yoon looked at Daniel with his blind eyes. He said the boy had eaten. Daniel said he had eaten. Yoon said the boy had slept. Daniel said he hadn't slept, but that was normal.
Yoon nodded. He said they had to enter the council hall slowly, that there was no need for fuss, that the most important thing was the first second when Moon saw his face. The morning was clear, fresh. The snow in the courtyard was melting. The air smelled of meltwater and pine. The council hall filled up. 12 elders, teachers, senior students in the second circle. Everyone was waiting. No one knew. Moon sat in the center in a black hanbok. His face was calm. A cup of tea stood before him. Today they were supposed to discuss the new rules for accepting the next generation of students. The senior elder named Hyun Debin opened the meeting with a strike of a small bell. And then Daniel entered. With Yoon. With Hae-jin, with Min Soo. Through the large double doors, he walked calmly across the hall and stopped in the center of the circle, directly opposite Moon.
Not a trace of a smile on his face, not a trace of anger, just a face. The hall fell silent. Someone on the middle bench dropped a cup. The cup shattered. No one turned their heads. Moon froze. For the first time in all this time, Moon's face did what Daniel had long been waiting for. Moon's face cracked. Just for a second, just his eyes, just his pupils dilated. Then the mask returned. But the entire hall saw that second. All 12 elders, all the teachers, all the senior students. They saw it with eyes that could not be commanded not to see. Daniel bowed to the council. The bow was even, not like a student, like a man. He said in an even voice that he was returning from an embassy mission that had been interrupted by circumstances requiring investigation by the council, that he personally was not making any accusations, that he personally was asking the council to review Elder Moon's report on the embassy mission and compare it with the circumstances that would be attested to by the servant of the teacher who had accompanied the embassy, that the servant was present and ready to testify. The hall fell even more silent. The word servant was wrong. Servants do not testify before the council. It is a violation of all protocols. Senior Elder Hyun opened his mouth to object, and then Sora stepped into the hall. Not in a servant's attire, in the attire of Elder Yoon's apprentice, a dark blue training hanbok with white trim, with a sword at her belt. Already a real wooden training sword, not a hidden one. Her hair was tied in a bun, as befits a student. She bowed to the council. Low, neat, just as Yoon had taught her. This was more powerful than anything Daniel could have said. The servant who wasn't there turned out to be a student who was, and Yoon himself had enrolled this student in the academy 2 months ago
with the signatures of 2 witnesses. All the documents were in the archives. Min-soo could produce them in an hour. Moon realized he had lost. Not loudly, quietly, definitely. He didn't flinch. He didn't scream. He just slowly lowered his eyes to his cup. And when he looked up, they were different. Not angry, tired. Very tired. Like a man who had carried a stone for 20 years and finally set it down. Senior Elder Hyun was silent for a long time. Then he rang a bell. He announced an investigation. He appointed a commission. Yoon joined the commission. Hae-jin joined. One of the independent elders who had already bowed to Daniel after the debate joined. An old woman in a gray hanbok. Her name was Chae Sonok. The investigation lasted 2 weeks. Much was uncovered during those 2 weeks. Records were found of 6 assassination attempts that had not been carried through to completion over the past 20 years.
All 6 victims were either independent elders or their disciples. All 6 incidents had been written off as accidents. A list was found of people who had disappeared in the mountains during the same period. 13 names. All were connected to controversial interpretations of the treaties. A letter from Binho was found, the one Sora had discovered back then and which Daniel had kept. Much else was found. Letters from other gates addressed personally to Moon with coded phrases. Lists of poison purchases made through third parties, bribes paid to guards. Moon did not deny it. It was a peculiarity that Daniel did not understand at first. Moon admitted everything. He signed all the protocols. He didn't defend himself. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't ask for leniency. He sat calmly and affixed his seal where required. On the 12th day of the investigation, Moon requested a private audience with Daniel. Yoon said it couldn't be agreed to. That Moon was dangerous even in the position of a defendant. That he might have hidden poisons on his fingers or needles in his sleeve. Daniel agreed to meet him, but not in his office. In the archives, and not alone, with Min-soo as a witness, and in an open room with 2 guards standing by the half-open door. They met in the archivist's small office. Min-soo sat nearby as a witness with pen and paper. Moon looked 10 years older than he had 2 weeks ago. His gray hair had turned white. His eyes had sunken. The skin on his hands had become as thin as paper. He said he hadn't come to ask for forgiveness, nor to make excuses. That he wanted to tell one thing, that the boy might understand. 20 years ago, a man came to Moon in his youth. Late at night in his quarters, when Moon had just been appointed a junior teacher, not from the academy, from some place Moon doesn't remember. He doesn't remember the man's face either. He only remembers that the man was tall and spoke in a quiet voice
and smelled of something strange, not incense, something else. Perhaps the dry leaves of a certain tree. Perhaps something Moon had never encountered again. This man gave Moon an assignment. The assignment was simple: to ensure that certain interpretations of the treatises were not challenged, that the interpretations remained uniform, that those who tried to dig through the old archives disappeared before they found anything, that the man said that if Moon agreed, Moon would receive a long life and a seat on the council, that Moon agreed without much thought, that at the moment of agreement, something clicked in Moon's head, that at the moment of the click, a light flashed before Moon's eyes for a second, that after that light, Moon remembers his task, but he doesn't remember the man's face. He doesn't remember the meeting place. He doesn't remember a single detail of the conversation. except the assignment itself.
That when Moon tries to think about it, his head hurts so much that his vision spins. That Moon had thought his whole life that he had migraines, that only in the last few weeks, when Moon realized the boy would win, did Moon first think that the migraines weren't migraines, that it was a block. That someone had put up a block so Moon wouldn't remember. That Moon had been protecting something for 20 years and didn't know what exactly. That Moon sincerely thought he was protecting tradition. That it was only when the boy started talking about the original treatises that had burned centuries before Moon's time that Moon first asked himself why he was so sure there was only one correct version, and he couldn't find an answer within himself. Only a headache. Daniel listened. He was silent. Min-Soo wrote down every word. When Moon finished, Daniel asked calmly if Moon knew where the misty rift was currently most active. Moon flinched. He hadn't expected that question. He nodded. He named the area, the Valley of Seven Mirrors. An old name. No one had used it for 300 years. He said he'd heard it 3 days ago from messengers from the south who were passing by his place of detention. He said he hadn't had time to report it to the council, that he would report it now. Daniel nodded. Min-Soo wrote that down too. 2 days later, the council made its decision. Elder Moon Hosuk is stripped of his rank and placed under house arrest, forbidden from leaving the academy for life. The investigation continues. Teacher Cho Gi-ryong and 3 other implicated teachers were expelled from the clan and stripped of their ranks. Seo Jihwan was officially recognized as a student of special merit and transferred to the inner courtyard with access to the Grand Library. Sora was officially recognized as his protective disciple and registered in the academic department. Han Yuna was recognized as a junior physician under Elder Yuna with the right to practice independently in the villages at the foot of the mountain. Min-Soo is officially relieved of her duties as archivist and placed under Elder Yoon's supervision as a student undergoing meridian restoration. So Hae-jin remains the curator, but now the curator does not supervise but accompanies, with the right to vote on decisions made. That same evening, Daniel gathered a circle in Yoon's room. 6 people: Yoon, Yuna, Sora, Min-Soo, Hae-jin, and Daniel himself. They sat on mats around a low table. Candles burned in the corners of the room. Yuna placed her silk cloth with 7 dots on the table. Hae-jin placed an empty vial, the very same one. Daniel had returned it unused. Min-Soo brought a copy of the map of the shepherd's trails with a crane pattern. Sora placed a wooden sword with an iron hilt. Yoon placed a needle, a wooden one made of the wood of quiet hearing. 6 objects lay in the center of the table. Daniel looked at each of them, then at each face, and began to tell his story. This time, for good. About his past life, about the car in the river, about the hall, about the 6 candles, about the 7th, about how there were 6 before him and they didn't return, about Juan's words that the boy was the only one who came remembering the names, about the misty rift, about how Moon was a guardian who didn't remember what he was guarding, about how he was perhaps guarding this very memory, about how something very ancient awaits in the mist. Everyone listened. No one interrupted. Yuna covered her face with her hands once when Daniel spoke of the embroidered pattern and how she resonates with another's memory. Sora gripped her sword tighter. Min-Soo took it all in with her eyes. Hae-jin sat motionless. Yoon listened, his blind face bowed.
When Daniel finished, he felt a lightness he hadn't felt in 3 months. Yoon spoke first.
He said that the second part of the story would begin soon, that they needed to get stronger in time, that the time of the thin ice was running out, that the misty rift would be looking for them before they reached it, that they had maybe 6 months for this, maybe less, that starting tomorrow, the circle would train together, in the mornings, every morning without exception. Yoon nodded. Sora nodded. Min-soo nodded. Hae-jin was the last to nod, but she did so firmly. That same night, Daniel entered the hall. Hwan was waiting. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood 5 others. So-mire, with a sword, dressed in simple Goryeo-era clothing. Jang-il, with a brush and ink stains on his fingers. An old woman with herbs, whose name Daniel had only just learned. Her name was Baek Nam-son. 700 years since her death. An herbalist who had been considered a witch in her time. A man with a hammer whom Daniel had never seen before. His name was Lee Kyung-ho,
a blacksmith and master of the warhammer, and a woman in simple teacher's clothes who introduced herself as Yoon So-ran, a teacher of children, a 5th-generation mentor. Hwan said it was time to the boy to everyone left, that the boy had passed the first circle, that the circle was short, that the boy now had his own circle in the real world consisting of 6 people, that in the hall the circle also consisted of 6 masters, and that this was no coincidence, that each of the 6 masters in the hall was connected to one of the 6 in the real world, that this connection grows stronger as the circles learn of each other, that when the 2 circles meet, 7 candles will light up again, and that then they will enter the mist together and encounter what has been forgotten there. Daniel asked quietly who had extinguished the 7th candle 1,000 years ago. Last time, Hwan had avoided answering. This time, he looked at him for a long time and answered. He said it was them.
That there had been 7 masters in one circle 1,000 years ago, and one of them had betrayed the others. That he hadn't betrayed them to enemies, not out of greed, out of something else, something that Hwan still cannot put into words. That the traitor took a part of the others' memories and left them to die, one by one. That the traitor is what now lives in the mist, that the boy is not going out, that the boy is going in, that the 7th awaits in the mist, that the 7th remembers more than all the others, and that he will meet the boy as an old acquaintance. Hwan lowered his eyes. He spoke the final sentence, that the boy's 3rd name, the one they will give him at the edge of the rift, is the traitor's name. That the boy must not be afraid, because the boy is not a traitor. The boy has only inherited his name after 1,000 years and 6 failed attempts. That the 6 before him were imperfect. Each remembered a part. Each came alone. None of them had a circle in the real world, and so each one vanished into the mist. That the boy is the first to arrive with a complete memory and a gathered circle. That this is the whole point. That only the one who bears the traitor's name can return to the other 6 and close the circle. Daniel was silent for a long time. He stared at the floor of the hall. Then he asked one thing. He asked whom the traitor had betrayed. Hwan smiled very quietly.
He said he had betrayed those standing behind him right now. That he had betrayed Jihwan himself. That he had betrayed Meyer. That he had betrayed Baek Nam-son and Jang Il-ya and Lee Kyung-ho and Yoon So-ran. That he had betrayed everyone in this hall, and that only the boy could repay their debt. Daniel nodded. He said he would repay it, that he didn't know how, but that he would repay it. Jihwan blew out the 5th candle of the 6 standing there. Then he quickly lit it again. He said it was a test, that the candles were in his hands,
That the boy was ready. That the second arc would begin when the boy opened his eyes.
and that in this second arc, everything would be different. That Jihwan and the other 5 would no longer come in his dreams as they had before, that now they would come while awake through the 6 in the circle, that Yuna would see Baek Nam-son sitting among the herbs, that Sora would sense Meyer holding a sword, that Min-soo would hear Jang Il-ya in the rustling of paper, that Hae-jin would recognize Yoon So-ran in the mirror, that Yoon would meet Lee Kyung-ho in the ringing of the needle, that the boy would be the link, that without him, the connection wouldn't work. Daniel woke up. It was getting light outside the window. On the table in the room lay Yuna's silk with 7 dots, which she had left in the circle yesterday. 6 dots glowed with a soft light that hadn't been there before. They glowed from within the fabric. The 7th in the center was dark, and it waited. Daniel sat down on the mat. He stared at the silk for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked over to the window. He opened it. The air was fresh. The light was already on in the infirmary. Yoon had risen before dawn. Sora stood by the western gate with a wooden sword. She was performing her first morning form, this time correctly. Among students of her rank, not out of spite, simply to become stronger. Somewhere near the grassy slope, Yoon was collecting dew from young wormwood. Min-soo was in the archives unrolling the first scroll of the new day. Hae-jin stood on her small terrace in white, looking toward the east. 6 people at the academy moved as one that morning, and each of them felt the warm breath of the master from the hall on their skin. The first arc of Seo Jihwan's story had ended. The second awaited beyond the horizon of the Valley of 7 Mirrors in the 7th unburned candle.